Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I don't know how it started. I don't know when it began appearing, but one night, we saw it. The carnival. It wasn't like any other. It didn't announce itself with the usual sounds of excitement and laughter, the usual bright lights and music. No, it arrived quietly, as if it had always been there, hiding just out of sight. One night, we were walking home, and there it was, sprawled out along the edge of the town square. The flicker of soft lights barely visible in the mist. A silent call inviting us in. The others were excited. They didn't know yet what I knew, what I had started to suspect. There was something about it that wasn't quite right. Something unsettling in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. People in town had been whispering about it for weeks. Did you hear? The carnival only opens at night. It's strange, isn't it? Never saw any of the workers during the day. But no one seemed to care. They were curious, eager to go, and the more they talked about it, the more it seemed like some kind of irresistible force drawing them in. I tried to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to see it for myself. And so, one evening, just before sunset, I found myself walking toward the carnival, unsure if it was a decision I would regret. The entrance was a twisted archway made of rusted metal, the sign reading the mysterious carnival flickering in and out as if it were barely clinging to life. The smell of old popcorn and candy lingered in the air, but there was a sharpness to it, something that tasted of dust and decay. I stepped forward, hearing the faint sounds of a calliope organ playing somewhere in the distance. The music was odd, not lively like carnival tunes usually were, but slow, haunting, almost like a lullaby. It made me uneasy. I walked deeper into the carnival grounds, the shadows stretching long and thin across the pathways. The lights above, dimmed and flickering, cast strange, warped shadows on the ground, turning everything into something just a little bit off. At first, there were only a few people scattered around. They moved quietly, almost as if in a trance, strolling beneath the glowing tents, their faces hidden in the dim light. I noticed that some of them seemed unfamiliar. I didn't recognize them, but I didn't think too much about it. I was just another curious soul drawn to the mystery of it all. I walked past the first booth, where a fortune teller sat behind a velvet curtain, her face hidden beneath the folds of a dark scarf. Her eyes caught mine for just a moment, and she smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a knowing smile, a smile that made me feel like she saw something in me that I didn't want her to. I hurried on, my heart beginning to race. Something wasn't right. I could feel it now, that strange pressure in the air. The carnival seemed to be holding its breath, watching, waiting. My mind kept drifting back to the stories I'd heard from others, people who'd gone missing, only to be found days later standing on the carnival stage, smiling at the crowd, as though they were no longer themselves. Just stay for a little while, I told myself. It's just a carnival. There's no harm. But as I walked further in, something changed. The lights dimmed, the shadows deepened, and the sounds of the carnival became distorted, warped in the corners of my mind. I glanced around, noticing that the crowd had grown, but they were all walking in one direction, toward the main stage. I could feel my pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The stage was set in the center of the carnival, and as I approached it, I saw the performers dressed in bright, colorful costumes, their faces painted in elaborate, exaggerated smiles. But there was something wrong with them, something unnatural. Their eyes, they didn't blink. Why are they staring at me? I muttered under my breath. Before I could take another step, someone beside me grabbed my arm. I looked to my left, and there she was, Sarah, an old friend from high school. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I froze. "What are you talking about?" She looked around nervously, her eyes darting to the stage. "I've been here before." She paused, her eyes wide with fear. "They took me. I didn't want to come back. But I had no choice. You don't know what happens when they choose you." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to ask her more, but before I could, she was gone, vanishing into the crowd without a trace. I spun around, but all I saw were the performers moving into place on the stage, their heads tilting in unison to face me. The music stopped. The crowd went silent. And then the curtains parted, and there, standing in the center of the stage, was someone I knew, someone I hadn't seen in years. Jason. He was grinning, his face painted with that same exaggerated smile, his eyes glazed over, vacant. "Help me," he mouthed, but his lips didn't move. It was a soundless plea, as though the carnival had stolen his voice. I staggered back, my legs shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. The crowd began to chant, their voices blending into one indistinguishable hum. The performers, those lifeless figures, began to move toward me. I turned and ran. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, the carnival stayed with me, just beyond my reach, always drawing me back. I had to escape. As I neared the exit, I saw the shadowy figure of Sarah again. She reached out to me, her face expressionless. "You can't leave," she whispered. "None of us can leave." Suddenly, I was outside the carnival gates, gasping for air. But when I looked back, there was nothing, no carnival, no lights, no performers. Just an empty field stretching out behind me. I looked down at my hand, and the cold sweat trickled down my neck. In the dim light of the street lamp, I saw the faintest outline of a smile, painted in blood-red ink, etched into my palm. I had been marked. And soon, I would return. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The image of Jason, his eyes pleading for help, his mouth unable to speak, haunted my every thought. And Sarah, her words echoed in my mind. "None of us can leave." What did that mean? Had they truly been taken? Or were they part of something far darker? By morning, I tried to convince myself that I just imagined it all. That it was some sort of twisted nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress. But there was no escaping the reality of what I had seen. The carnival was real. I had been there. And something had marked me. I avoided the streets where it had appeared the night before. I stayed home, locked the doors, and tried to shake the growing unease gnawing at the pit of my stomach. But as the days passed, I couldn't help but notice things. Strange things. Like the way people would stare at me, their eyes lingering a little too long, like they knew something I didn't. Or the way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking. It was like I was being watched, followed, like I was being drawn towards something. Then, the whispers started. People talking in hushed tones about the carnival that had returned. But it wasn't the same. No, this time it wasn't just the performers that were the center of attention. People in the town were vanishing. One by one, they disappeared, without a trace. Friends, neighbors, even strangers. All were last seen near the carnival. All were later found in the same strange condition as Jason had been, on stage, wearing that painted grin, eyes wide and lifeless, as if they were no longer human. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The carnival had come back for them. And it wanted me, too. I couldn't tell anyone. No one would believe me. But there was one thing I knew for certain now. I had to go back. I had to find out what happened to all of them and why the carnival was choosing people like this. I couldn't live in fear any longer. Maybe there was a way to end it. Maybe there was a way to escape it. I had to try. The night was colder than usual when I finally made the decision. A thick fog rolled in, swirling around the streets, cloaking the world in a dense, suffocating haze. I knew it was happening again. The carnival was waiting. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and headed toward the square. The mist seemed to part just for me, like it was leading me directly to the entrance. The gate stood there, ominously, just as it had before. The flickering sign, the rusted archway, the eerie silence. Everything felt wrong, but I couldn't turn back now. I stepped through the gates. This time, the carnival was alive, louder, more crowded. The calliope music blared through the air, distorted, as if it were coming from every direction at once. But there was something different now. A feeling of urgency. The crowd was more frantic, more frenzied than before. People were pushing toward the stage, their faces locked in a trance, their eyes wide, vacant. It was as if they were all marching to their doom, following an invisible force that pulled them forward without question. I moved with the crowd, trying to stay unnoticed, trying to blend in. But it was impossible. They were all looking at me now, watching me, waiting for me. I turned a corner and saw the stage in the distance. The performers were already in position, their faces painted, their eyes blank. But I saw something else now, something I hadn't noticed before. The people who had disappeared, who I had once known, were standing among them. But they weren't people anymore. They were hollow shells, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were puppets controlled by invisible strings. And there, at the front of the stage, was Sarah. She was grinning, her painted smile grotesque. But it wasn't her smile anymore. It was something else, something that belonged to the carnival. She saw me. Her eyes locked with mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of recognition in them. A flicker of the person she used to be, before she became one of them. I took a step forward, but I couldn't move fast enough. The performers, the people, they started to converge on me. I could feel the air shift, the weight of it bearing down on me, suffocating me. I had to get out. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, like I was walking through thick mud. Every step was a struggle. Behind me, I heard the laughter. Low, guttural, distorted. It wasn't the sound of joy. It was something far worse, a sound that sent chills down my spine. I wasn't alone. I ran through the carnival, but no matter where I went, it was the same. The tents, the stages, the performers, everything stretched on endlessly. I was trapped. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned to see a figure approaching, draped in a cloak, its face hidden in shadows. "You think you can leave?" The voice was muffled, distorted, but I could hear the malice in it. No one leaves. Not once they've been chosen. I backed away, panic rising in my chest. I won't join you. I won't be like them. But the figure only chuckled. It's too late for that. You're already part of it. The carnival had claimed me. There was no escape. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The figure in the cloak stepped closer, its silhouette growing clearer with every passing second. It was taller than any person I had ever seen, its form unnaturally elongated, as though it didn't belong in this world. Its presence seemed to warp the air around it, distorting everything it touched. You should have known better, the figure whispered, its voice a hissing echo that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. Once you step inside, there's no leaving. Not really. I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. The carnival noises continued around me, but they felt muffled, as if they were coming from miles away. I could barely focus on anything but the towering figure before me. I had to get away. There had to be a way out. But the carnival had changed. The tents, once so vibrant, now loomed like dark, oppressive structures, their flaps fluttering in the wind like the wings of a giant insect. The bright lights from the Ferris wheel, the clashing colors, they all seemed so far away. The whole place had become a labyrinth, a twisted version of reality that held me in its grip. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going anymore, just needing to escape that presence behind me. My breath came in sharp gasps, my legs burning from the exertion, but no matter how fast I moved, the carnival seemed to stretch on endlessly. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to chase me. Then, I saw them. The performers, my friends, my neighbors, stood at the edge of the main stage, their eyes vacant, their smiles painted on grotesquely. They were staring at me, but they weren't seeing me. They were part of the carnival now, just like Sarah, just like Jason. And they didn't move. They didn't speak. I couldn't make sense of it. How had they become like this? Was this what happened to everyone who stepped inside? Were they all destined to become actors in this macabre show? A voice broke through my thoughts. "Don't run," it called softly, like a whisper in the wind. It was Sarah's voice. I froze. It came from behind me. Slowly, I turned. There she was, standing alone in the middle of the carnival grounds, her once vibrant face now hollow, her body stiff and rigid. But her eyes still held a glimmer of recognition, a flash of the person she used to be. "Sarah," I whispered, taking a step toward her. "Please, come back. You don't belong here." She blinked, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of who she had been. But it quickly vanished, replaced by that hollow, empty stare. "You can't leave," she said, her voice distant, flat. "None of us can." I reached out, desperate to pull her away, to break whatever hold the carnival had over her. But as my hand brushed against her arm, a jolt of cold electricity ran through me. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding in my chest. "Don't touch her," came the voice again, the cloaked figure's voice, now louder, more distorted. "It's already too late." I turned and saw it again, stepping from the shadows, its form twisting like smoke in the night air. It was watching me with those hollow, faceless eyes, as though it could see right through me, to my very soul. "You don't belong here," I said, trembling. "I'm not part of your game. I'll fight. I'll find a way out." The figure tilted its head, as if amused by my defiance. "You've already been chosen," it said, the words heavy with finality. just like the others. You'll perform like them, like all of us, forever trapped in the show. The ground beneath me seemed to shift again, as if the carnival itself was alive, reacting to my every movement. The lights began to flicker and strobe, the music warping into a dissonant, maddening tune. My vision blurred as the world around me seemed to collapse into itself, the carnival becoming a swirling vortex, pulling me closer. I had no choice but to run, to push forward, to escape the overwhelming presence that threatened to consume me. But no matter where I turned, I couldn't escape it. The carnival was everywhere. It was in the air, in the shadows, in the flicker of the lights. There was nowhere left to hide. And then I saw it. The stage. The center of it all. I ran toward it, desperate, but my legs felt like lead. The crowd, those lost souls, moved like puppets, their eyes locked onto me, their smiles stretched wide, unblinking. I pushed through them, feeling their cold hands graze my skin, their whispers brushing against my ears. At the front of the stage stood Sarah, her eyes pleading once more, though her face was locked in that twisted smile. The lights above her flickered erratically, casting strange, unnatural shadows across her face. The carnival had consumed her. It had consumed all of them. The figure was there, too, standing just behind her. It reached out a hand, its fingers stretching toward me. "You belong to us now," it whispered, its voice a low growl that reverberated in my chest. "You're one of us. Forever." I reached out, desperate to grab hold of Sarah, to pull her away from the nightmare that had claimed her. But as I touched her, she vanished. In the blink of an eye, she was gone, leaving nothing but empty space where she had stood. And then, everything went dark. The last thing I heard was the faint sound of carnival music, distorted and distant, echoing in the void. When I awoke, it was as if I had never left. The ground was cold, the air still heavy with the smell of something sweet and cloying, like burnt sugar. My body ached as though I had been running for miles, but when I opened my eyes, there was no carnival around me. No lights. No strange figure. No twisted performers. I was lying on the side of a quiet road, the morning sun rising in the distance, casting soft light across the empty street. The world was peaceful, too ordinary. The events of last night felt distant, like a dream I couldn't fully grasp. I sat up slowly, rubbing my temples, trying to shake off the fog that clung to my thoughts. My clothes were torn, my shoes scuffed as though I had been walking for hours. But there was no sign of the carnival, no end of the chaos I had just experienced. The road stretched out before me, empty and unremarkable. My car was gone. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. No messages. No calls. Only a blank screen, flickering with static. I ran my fingers through my hair, still shaken, still unsure if any of it had been real. But then, as I stood up, something caught my eye, a small piece of paper, crumpled and yellowed, fluttering in the breeze. It lay just a few feet away, half hidden in the grass. I bent down and picked it up, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was a ticket. A carnival ticket. The faded edges of the paper were decorated with swirling colors, the image of a grand tent emblazoned on the front. The words "The Mysterious Carnival" were printed in bold, dark letters, as though they had been burned into the paper. The date, the time, everything matched perfectly. Everything except for one thing. There was no mention of where it was located. Just a single, cryptic message. "You've seen what others have not. Now you belong to the show." The words seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like they were alive, shifting in the light. My heart raced, a cold shiver running down my spine. What did it mean? Had I really been part of that nightmare? Or was this some twisted reminder, a mark of my participation in something I couldn't escape? As I stood there, staring at the ticket, the world around me began to change again. The air thickened, the once calm breeze turning to a restless wind. A low hum echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. In the distance, barely visible against the horizon, I saw it. The carnival. It was back. But this time, there were no lights, no clamor. Just shadows, flickering at the edges of my vision. The tents were huge, towering over the landscape like dark, looming figures. The Ferris wheel spun slowly, its massive shape distorted in the dimming light, as if it had been there for years. I wasn't sure if it was real or just a mirage, but one thing was clear, the carnival was calling me. And no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, I knew it would always be waiting, just beyond the edge of my sight, ready to pull me back into its twisted, eternal show. The ticket in my hand began to smolder, its edges curling as if burned by an unseen flame. I dropped it quickly, but the damage was done. I couldn't escape. The carnival would never let me go. The ticket crumbled into ash at my feet, disintegrating before my eyes, leaving no trace of its existence behind. My chest tightened. I had barely begun to understand what was happening, but the realization hit me hard. I was not just a witness. I was part of it. A performer in an eternal, twisted show where escape was a mere illusion. I turned away from the carnival's distant glow, but it didn't matter. The world around me shifted as if the earth itself conspired to keep me here. The road stretched on endlessly in both directions, but no matter how far I walked, the carnival remained in my peripheral vision, like an unwelcome shadow, following my every step. I heard its haunting melody in the air, the soft music of a calliope winding in and out of my mind. It wasn't long before the reality of my situation sank in deeper. People I had known, people I loved, had been lost to this place. And now, I was lost too. There was no way back. I had become part of something far darker, something beyond my comprehension. I tried to scream for help, but no sound came out. The air seemed to swallow my voice whole. I wanted to run, to find someone, anyone, who could help me break free from the clutches of this nightmare. But all I saw were the pale faces of the carnival performers, the same faces I had seen in the show, standing at the edge of my vision, waiting. I turned around one last time, hoping against hope that it was all a dream. But the carnival was still there, its lights dimming like fading stars, and the soft murmur of the crowd echoed through the night. It was then that I understood the carnival was not just a place. It was a trap, a part of something bigger, and those who entered never truly left. The performers weren't just actors. They were once like me, wandering souls who had unknowingly crossed the threshold. And now, they were trapped in an endless loop, playing their parts again and again. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy, and I spun around. But there was no one there. The wind was the only answer, whispering in my ear, carrying the faint, eerie laugh of the carnival master. I stumbled backward, the world spinning around me. My thoughts were fractured, but one thing remained clear: I would never escape. The carnival had claimed me, and now I was a part of its dark, twisted reality. And then, as the last remnants of hope faded, I understood the truth. The show never ended. It would go on for eternity. And I would be trapped in it forever, just another mask, another performer, waiting to take my place under the spotlight. It started with a question. A simple one, but enough to make me stop, to pause my life for a moment. Have you ever heard a song that you can't explain? I asked myself that day. It was like a whisper in my mind, the first stirrings of something unsettling. I had just bought an old tape recorder from a local second-hand shop. The kind of place where time seems to slow down, where the air smells of dust and forgotten memories. The shopkeeper, an elderly man, had barely glanced at me as I paid for the recorder, as though he knew what was about to happen, but said nothing. The recorder, an antique, was heavy in my hands, worn around the edges but still functional. I had no particular use for it, but I liked its old-school charm. A curiosity, a relic of the past that I could fill with my own voice or music. When I first plugged it in at home, it hummed to life with the kind of mechanical whirring that felt strangely comforting. But then, it happened. The sound. It wasn't the tape spinning, nor was it the static of an unused machine. It was music, soft, faint, a melody that seemed to come from nowhere. The tune was simple at first, almost pleasant. It sounded like something you might hear in a dream, a memory you couldn't quite recall but felt deep within you. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a coincidence, the tape recorder picking up some old radio frequency, some distant station, a glitch in the machinery. But no matter how many times I turned the machine on or off, the music always came back. And always the same song. At first, I thought it was just a novelty. Maybe I had unknowingly found a hidden track, an old recording from the past that had been forgotten. But soon, I realized that the music was not coming from the recorder itself. It was inside my head, inside my mind, as if the melody had taken root there, growing and spreading like an infection. I tried to escape it. I moved the recorder to different rooms, turned it off, unplugged it entirely. But still, the sound persisted, faint but undeniable. It began to follow me. Everywhere I went, no matter how far I moved, the music played, just on the edge of hearing, always the same soft, lilting tune. It became a presence in my life, something I couldn't escape, even as I tried to push it out of my thoughts. It was then that I realized something more disturbing. The melody wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling. It was like it was shaping my world, warping it in subtle ways. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air felt thicker, and the once comfortable spaces I inhabited began to feel alien, like I no longer belonged there. It was as though the song had seeped into the very fabric of my existence, altering everything it touched. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things, that I was tired, or maybe just a little too obsessed with my new toy. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. I knew there was something more to this melody, something that I wasn't yet ready to understand. That night, as I lay in bed, the song played louder than ever before, ringing in my ears. My heart raced as the sound filled the darkness surrounding me. It wasn't a distant noise anymore, it was inside me, everywhere. And I couldn't escape. The music didn't stop. It was as if it had become a part of me, threading its way through my thoughts, weaving itself into every waking moment. I couldn't concentrate on anything anymore. I couldn't focus on work or on simple tasks around the house. Every room felt different now. The walls seemed to hum with the melody, as though the house itself was alive with the sound. I tried to tell myself it was just a phase, that I was overthinking it. But I couldn't deny how much it affected me. It wasn't just the song, it was the way it made me feel. The light in my apartment seemed dimmer. The shadows at the corners of the room grew deeper, darker. At night, I could feel something watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of my sight, though every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I started to lose track of time. Hours blurred together, and the music seemed to distort my sense of reality. I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming anymore. I began to wonder if the melody was some kind of curse, something that was slowly unraveling my mind. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the tune still ringing in my ears. Sometimes it was so loud it drowned out all other sounds. It wasn't long before I began hearing it outside my apartment, too. On the street, in the hallways of my building, even in the distant hum of traffic. The melody followed me wherever I went, as if it were attached to my every step. I would go to the store, and there it was, faint but persistent, playing from an unknown source. I would sit in a cafe, trying to have a conversation, and I could hear it in the background, like the soft murmur of a distant memory. I asked around, tried to find anyone else who had heard it. Maybe it was some sort of urban legend, some strange phenomenon. But no one knew anything. They looked at me as if I were crazy, even though I was certain they could hear it too. It wasn't in their minds, though. They couldn't sense it the way I could. It was always just out of reach for them, fading before they could fully acknowledge it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront it. I took the tape recorder, feeling the weight of it in my hands, and I sat in the middle of my living room, waiting for the melody to play. I stared at the machine, willing it to make sense, to show me where the sound came from. But no matter how many times I hit play, no matter how many times I rewound the tape, the music came from somewhere else. It filled the room, flooded my mind, as if the melody had no origin at all. I could feel my mind starting to break. The sound was not just music, it was a force, a pressure that pushed against my thoughts. It was slowly suffocating me, eroding my sense of reality. It was like a weight, heavy and unyielding, pressing down on everything I knew. I wanted to scream, to rip the sound out of me, but it only grew louder. In that moment, I understood. The song wasn't just a melody, it was a presence, a thing that wanted something from me. It had chosen me, for reasons I couldn't fathom, and it wouldn't let me go. I couldn't escape. No matter what I did, no matter where I went, the music was there, always there, surrounding me. I was no longer just listening to it, I was part of it. Days passed, but time felt irrelevant now. The melody lingered like a persistent shadow, always there, creeping through the cracks of my life. I stopped leaving my apartment. I couldn't. Every time I ventured out, the song would follow, like an invisible tether pulling me back into its web. I wasn't sure what it wanted anymore. At first, it seemed almost harmless, a haunting lullaby that I couldn't escape. Now, it felt sinister. The tone had changed. It had become darker, more insistent, like it was calling to something in me I didn't want to acknowledge. I began to lose track of reality. The boundaries between the music and my thoughts were starting to blur. I couldn't think straight. When I closed my eyes, I could see it, the song, like a dark ribbon winding its way through my mind. And when I opened my eyes, the world felt wrong. The walls of my apartment seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the melody, the floors groaning in time with its beat. The shadows at the corners of the room, once benign, now shifted and stretched unnaturally, as though they were trying to take form, to become something else. I noticed more changes in my surroundings, subtle at first but gradually impossible to ignore. The air smelled different, thick, almost metallic, like something decayed was lurking just beneath the surface. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, twisting shadows that moved of their own accord. The furniture around me seemed to shift imperceptibly every time I looked away. Nothing felt stable anymore. I tried to leave again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could outrun it. I walked out into the street, the world outside seeming normal, as though everything had returned to how it should be. But then, I heard it again, the faint hum of the melody. It was there, just beyond the edge of hearing, like it was waiting for me. The sound wrapped itself around me, pulling me into a suffocating grip. I looked up, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I saw someone watching me. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the distance. They were motionless, blending into the shadows, yet somehow, I knew they were aware of me. I tried to focus, to make sense of it, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. The music, however, remained, louder now, vibrating in the air. I stumbled back into my apartment, my hands shaking, my heart racing. The room felt colder than it had before, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The lights overhead flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. The music, though, never stopped. It filled the void, constant, like a heartbeat. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, in my bones. It was inside me, and I was trapped in it. I ran to the recorder, hoping that maybe if I could destroy it, it would stop. But when I touched it, I froze. The moment my fingers made contact with the machine, I felt something. A pull, a tug at my mind, like it was reaching out to me. The recorder was no longer just a device, it was alive, a part of whatever force had claimed me. I backed away from it, but the melody followed. It grew louder, more urgent. I could hear it shifting, twisting, changing in ways that made my skin crawl. It was no longer the simple tune I had first heard, it was a cacophony now, layers of sound overlapping, fighting for control, the rhythm becoming erratic, frantic. It was as if the music was screaming, but I could no longer hear its words. It was all noise, and it was tearing at my mind. I clutched my head in my hands, my vision blurring, as I realized that the melody wasn't just an external force, it was within me. I had become part of it, and it was consuming me, taking over every thought, every breath. My heart pounded in my chest, matching the frantic beat of the song. I could feel something more than just the music now. There was something else in the room with me, something watching. The shadows on the walls, once subtle, now moved, shifting, stretching, forming shapes that no longer seemed like mere tricks of light. The air was thick with their presence. I could hear the faintest scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor, drawing nearer. I turned, heart racing, my eyes wide in terror. The room was alive, swirling with dark shapes and sounds, the music drowning out everything else. And in the middle of it all, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was tall, slender, its face obscured by darkness. But its eyes, they gleamed. A cold, empty stare that seemed to pierce through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The song had taken root in my soul. And now, it was coming for me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure stood in front of me, its presence looming like a suffocating fog. The melody twisted, warped, becoming louder, more discordant, as though it were feeding off my terror. Every note scraped against my skull, every beat pounding in my chest, until I thought my heart might burst. And still, the figure, its face hidden in shadow, remained still, its eyes glowing with a cold, unfeeling intensity. I tried to speak, to ask it what it wanted, but my voice caught in my throat. The only sound that escaped was a strangled gasp, drowned out by the relentless music. It filled every corner of the room, pressing in from all sides, vibrating through my bones. The shadows around the figures seemed to twist, as if responding to some unseen command. The walls of my apartment, once familiar, felt like they were closing in, bending to the will of the music, the figure, whatever this force had become. Then, the figure moved. It stepped forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally, like it was made of shadows rather than flesh. I felt the air around me grow colder, and I shivered despite the heat of panic that burned through me. The figure raised one arm slowly, deliberately, and I saw something glimmer in its hand, a glint of metal. A key. It held the key out toward me, its eyes never leaving mine. The music shifted, now deep and slow, like a pulse, rhythmic and suffocating. I could feel my mind begin to crack, the pressure of the sound squeezing every last ounce of rational thought from me. I couldn't escape. It was everywhere. Inside me. The shadows. The figure. The key. All of it intertwining, suffocating. And then I understood. The key was for the recorder. It was the source. The music, it had all started with that damn machine. The figure, whatever it was its keeper. The melody was a prison, and I was its prisoner. I had been chosen to listen, to suffer, to be consumed by the song until I no longer existed outside of it. The key was a symbol of the final step in that process, the point of no return. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But my body was frozen, as if the very act of resistance was impossible. The figure extended the key further, and for a moment it felt like time itself had stopped. The music had quieted, its hum now just a faint pulse in the back of my mind, leaving an eerie silence. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability. There was no escaping it. There never had been. I reached for the key. My fingers brushed against it, and in that instant, the world shattered. The music exploded in my ears, louder than ever before, as if the very walls of the apartment had crumbled under its weight. The shadows thickened, twisted, and began to swirl around me, pulling me in, consuming me whole. The figure dissolved into the darkness, becoming one with the sound. I felt myself falling, as though the ground beneath me had given way. But instead of hitting the floor, I kept falling, deeper, further into the blackness. I didn't know how long I was falling. Time lost all meaning. The music surrounded me, now a cacophony of distorted sounds, voices, screams, and cries that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was overwhelming. The melody wasn't just a sound, it was a force, a wave of pure emotion, of despair, of madness, crashing over me. And then, finally, I stopped falling. I was no longer in my apartment. No longer in any place I could recognize. The world around me was different. The air was thick, oppressive. The shadows stretched impossibly long, and the melody continued to play, echoing through the darkness like an ancient chant, its source unknown. But I wasn't alone. In the distance, I saw them, figures, shadows, moving slowly toward me. They had no faces, only dark shapes, like ghosts without form. They were drawn to the music, as I was. They moved as though they were part of it, like they had always existed with it. I could feel my mind slipping, my thoughts dissolving under the weight of the song. The figures reached out toward me, their hands, no, not hands, something else, something cold and inhuman, brushed against my skin. The melody grew louder, and the last shred of my sanity frayed away. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't hearing the music anymore. I was the music. It had consumed me completely. My mind, my body, everything I was, had become a part of the song. A never-ending echo in the void. And there, in the heart of the darkness, I understood there was no escape. No waking up. No freedom. I had become the melody without a source. The figure's eyes were the last thing I saw before everything went black. When I awoke, I couldn't tell where I was. The world felt different, like a dream that I couldn't quite grasp, slipping through my fingers the moment I tried to focus on it. The oppressive weight of the music had vanished, but its absence was more unnerving than the sound itself. The silence was thick, suffocating, like it had replaced everything that once made up my existence. I tried to move, but my body felt foreign, heavy, and unresponsive. My limbs were stiff, like I had been lying still for years. My eyes, when I managed to open them, didn't see the familiar surroundings of my apartment. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, cold, and empty. The air tasted of dust and decay, as if time itself had stopped here. I tried to remember how I had gotten here. The last thing I remembered was the figure, the key, the feeling of falling, and then, nothing. My mind seemed clouded, distant, as though the experience had torn away pieces of my memory. I couldn't hold on to it. It slipped away like water through a sieve, leaving only a gnawing emptiness. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I opened my mouth, but it felt as though there was no sound inside me. I couldn't hear my own voice, and I couldn't hear anything else either. There was only silence. A silence so deep that it felt like it had swallowed the world whole. Then, a sound. A faint tapping, far off in the distance. I froze. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, like a whisper in the dark. But as I strained to listen, the tapping grew louder. It was rhythmic, steady. It sounded like footsteps, like someone or something walking toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, a stark contrast to the silence around me. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't move. My body refused to obey me. The tapping grew louder, closer. It was coming for me. But from where? And what was it? I turned my head, forcing my stiff neck to move, trying to make sense of the darkness surrounding me. I saw nothing, just an empty void, a blackness so complete that it felt as if I had been cast into the heart of an abyss. The tapping grew louder still, echoing in my ears, until it was all I could hear. It filled my mind, drowned out everything else. I wasn't alone. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I wasn't alone, and whatever was coming for me had already found me. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, my mouth a desert. No sound emerged. The tapping was now only inches away. I could feel it, the presence, close, too close. It was right next to me. And then I saw it. A figure emerging from the blackness. A shape, indistinct at first, but slowly becoming clearer. It was tall, thin, and its face was hidden, just like the figure in my apartment. But there was something different about it now. This one was more real. The shadows that had once obscured its form were no longer there. It stepped forward, and I could see its face, pale, featureless, and yet there was something about it that made my blood run cold. It was as if it were a reflection of myself, a hollow version of me that had been twisted, warped by whatever force controlled this place. It reached toward me, its hand, or something like a hand, extended, its fingers elongated and unnatural. I wanted to move, to scream, but my body betrayed me. I was paralyzed, my mind screaming for release but unable to make a sound, unable to escape. The figure loomed over me, its cold, empty eyes staring down at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was the melody. I realized, in that horrible moment, that it was the melody that had brought me here. The figure, the place, the silence, it was all part of it. The song had consumed me, and now it was taking me somewhere else. Somewhere far worse than I could have ever imagined. The figure didn't touch me. It didn't need to. I felt the coldness spread through me, a numbness that consumed my limbs, my thoughts. The song, the melody, filled my head again, but now it wasn't just a tune. It was a symphony of despair, of madness, of voices calling out in pain, blending together in an overwhelming crescendo. It drowned out everything, the tapping, the figure, even my own thoughts. There was only the music. Only the song. It was all I could hear. All I could feel. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the silence returned. I was alone again. But I wasn't. Not really. The melody was still inside me, still reverberating in my mind. It was part of me now, like blood in my veins. And as I lay there, in the crushing stillness, I realized the truth. The song would never end. It was inside me. I was inside it. And there would be no escape. Not now. Not ever. I was the melody without a source. And it was forever. I woke up this morning in a city that felt too familiar, and yet something was wrong. I don't know why, but as I stepped outside, I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach, like a whisper in the back of my mind warning me about something. Maybe it was the strange stillness, or the odd quietness that hung in the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, but there was no sound. No birds, no distant hum of traffic. Just silence. I could feel the city around me, breathing, but it didn't sound like it should. It felt wrong. I glanced down at my clothes, hoping that was the cause of the unease. But no. I was dressed like I always was, in a worn jacket and faded jeans. So why did everything feel so unfamiliar? The street looked the same, every building, every store, every cracked sidewalk, all in their usual places, but there was a sense of emptiness, an absence of life. That's why I noticed it. Everyone around me, every person on the street, was wearing white. White shirts, white pants, white shoes. Not a single person was dressed in anything else. Their clothes were pristine, almost glowing in the dim light, and it felt out of place. Why were they all wearing white? Was this some kind of celebration? I blinked and realized something even stranger. They weren't moving in the usual way. There were no smiles, no waves, no conversations. Everyone walked with a steady, synchronized pace, as if they were part of a carefully rehearsed routine. They weren't looking at each other or at me. They were walking in perfect silence, heads slightly down, eyes focused straight ahead. No one spoke. I started walking too, but a wave of unease washed over me as I noticed that every single person on the street was looking at me. I was the only one not dressed in white, the only one who was different. Their stares were cold, unblinking, and dispassionate. It wasn't just that they were staring, it was the way their eyes seemed to see me, with a calm, almost deliberate detachment. I tried to shake it off. They were probably just tourists or people in some kind of event. But as I continued walking, I felt the weight of their gazes follow me, like invisible hands brushing against my skin, pulling at my very soul. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The silence was unbearable now. I tried to say something, anything, to break it, but my voice felt lost in the emptiness. "Hello?" I muttered, barely hearing my own words. No one responded. No one even moved. The pressure around me tightened. I needed to find someone I knew. Anyone. A friend. A family member. Just someone to break the stillness, to ground me back in the familiar. I looked around desperately, scanning the faces of the people in white, but all their faces were unfamiliar, distant. There were no friendly nods, no recognition, only cold, impassive stares. The fear began to creep in, slow at first, like a fog rolling in at dawn. The street stretched out before me, and yet no matter how far I walked, there were no changes, no signs of life, no escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just by the people around me, but by something else. Something greater, something that had put me here, in this place, in this time. Where was everyone I knew? Why was no one speaking? Why did the city feel so abandoned? I walked faster now, my steps echoing off the pavement, desperate to find someone, anyone, to explain what was happening. But the people in white, no, they weren't people, not really, remained silent, unaffected by my panic. Their eyes still never left me. And the silence roared in my ears. Every time I turned a corner, it was the same. More people in white, walking in perfect formation, not looking, not acknowledging. No one waved, no one smiled. No one said a word. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting the world into a muted gray. I couldn't breathe. Something was wrong. So wrong. I had to get out of here. But where was here? Where was I? The city felt endless now, stretching out like an ocean of light, and I was drowning in it. I didn't know how long I had been walking, but it felt like hours. The city stretched on, endless and unchanging. The streets were still silent, and the faces in the crowd remained unchanged. Each person was dressed in white, their expressions vacant, hollow, as though they weren't even human anymore. I had tried to speak to a few of them. I had reached out to ask, "What's happening? Where am I?" But every time, the people simply looked through me, as if they hadn't heard a word I'd said. Their eyes never wavered from their fixed, emotionless stare. They walked past me like I wasn't even there. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. I was suffocating in this suffocating silence, surrounded by strangers who wouldn't speak, wouldn't acknowledge me. My thoughts began to swirl in a chaotic mess. Am I dreaming? Am I dead? Is this some kind of punishment? I tried to steady myself, to think logically, but the panic was growing, slowly consuming every bit of rationality I had. I needed to find someone who wasn't like them. Someone who could talk, who could answer. My steps quickened as I searched the streets, turning corners frantically, scanning every face. But each face was the same. Eyes dull, expressions blank, lips sealed. I had crossed several blocks when I noticed something strange. At the far end of the street, where the shadows began to stretch long, I saw a figure that stood out from the rest. Unlike the others in white, this person wore something different. A dark color. A black jacket. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light or my eyes playing tricks on me, but I swore I saw a flicker of motion in the figure. Something alive. It wasn't just another blank stare walking in line. This figure seemed to shift, as if it were aware of its surroundings. Without thinking, I started toward it, my legs carrying me forward as if controlled by something else, something beyond my will. I didn't even care anymore what happened. I just needed to speak to someone, to break this oppressive silence. As I approached, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, a silhouette against the fading light. My steps slowed, uncertainty creeping back in, but I pushed it aside. I had to know. I had to break free of this bizarre trance. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice trembling. "Please, can you hear me?" There was no response. The figure didn't even flinch. I was close now, maybe just a few feet away. The figure was tall, with dark hair that caught the dim light, its face hidden beneath a hood, making it impossible to see any features. Still, I could feel it. This was not like the others. I was about to reach out, to touch the figure's shoulder, when something stopped me. The air around me seemed to thicken, a coldness creeping up my spine. And then, I heard it. The faintest sound, a voice, low and distorted, but unmistakable. A whisper. "Turn around." I froze. The voice was my own. But it wasn't just me. There was something wrong about it. It echoed in my ears, hollow and distorted, like the whisper of a stranger trying to imitate my own voice. I didn't know what to do. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, as if the ground had suddenly grown claws. The figure remained motionless, and the whisper repeated itself. "Turn around." I spun on my heel, my heart racing. There, at the other end of the street, another figure stood, dressed in the same white clothing as everyone else. Then another, and another. Slowly, they began to emerge from the shadows, walking toward me, their eyes fixed on me. They weren't just walking, they were moving in sync, each step calculated, coordinated. They didn't look at each other. They didn't seem to see anything but me. And as they drew closer, the cold weight of their stare pressed against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I turned back toward the figure in black, but it was gone. In its place was another person in white, standing in the exact same spot. The streets were closing in on me. I started running. My breath ragged, my heart pounding, my legs aching. I ran as fast as I could, but the people in white were always just a step behind me, always just within my reach. I could hear the soft shuffle of their footsteps behind me, following in perfect rhythm, like a choir of shadows. The city stretched out endlessly before me, no matter which direction I went. The same buildings, the same empty faces. I didn't know where I was anymore. I didn't know if I could escape. As I ran, I could feel their presence closing in, like a net, tightening, suffocating. And all the while, the whispering voice grew louder in my ears, as if the city itself was speaking to me, urging me to turn around, to face them. But I didn't. I couldn't. I wouldn't. I couldn't stop running, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath a frantic gasp in the thick, suffocating air. The city seemed endless, its streets stretching into an eternal maze. Each corner, each turn, led me deeper into the same white silence. It didn't matter how fast I ran, how desperately I tried to escape, every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw them. The people in white. Their cold, empty eyes locked onto mine, their movements synchronized, their pace unbroken. It was as if they were always there, just behind me, tracking my every step. They didn't hurry. They didn't need to. They knew they would catch me. They were catching me. I could feel their presence all around me, the air thick with their silent stares. It wasn't just their gaze that haunted me, it was the weight of it. The knowledge that they were watching me, waiting for me to crack, to turn around, to acknowledge them. I turned down another street, my legs burning, my muscles screaming for mercy. The buildings here were older, crumbling with age, but it didn't matter. It all looked the same, empty, lifeless, like a city frozen in time. I could feel it now, the pressure, the sense that this place wasn't just empty. It was watching me. Everything here was watching me. There were no more sounds of the city. No distant voices, no wind rustling through trees, no hum of electricity or faraway traffic. Just the soft shuffle of their footsteps, like an army closing in on me from all sides. I looked ahead and saw something, a door. It was small, almost hidden between two cracked walls, but it was there, and it seemed like my only chance. I made a beeline for it, my pulse racing. I grabbed the handle, pulled it open, and stumbled inside. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud. I was in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust, the air thick with a stale scent. There was no furniture, no windows. Just an empty room with a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I collapsed against the wall, my body trembling, my mind spinning. For a moment, I let myself breathe, the pounding in my chest slowly subsiding. I had escaped. I was safe. For now. But then, I heard it. A sound, low and unnatural, coming from the other side of the door. A knock. Soft, deliberate, measured. Knock. Knock. It was faint at first, just a whisper against the silence. But it grew louder with each passing second, the sound of knuckles against wood echoing through the small room. I froze. My eyes darted to the door. The knock didn't stop. It was relentless, each thud louder than the last. Knock. 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 I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall, my breathing growing shallow again. I had to get out. I had to. The door handle rattled. I sucked in a breath, my body rigid with fear. The handle turned, slowly, agonizingly. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The door creaked open, inch by inch, until it was fully ajar. The light from the hallway flooded the room, casting long shadows across the walls. There was no one there. No one at all. The hallway outside was empty. Silent. I didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. But before I could step forward, something caught my eye, something that made my stomach twist with fear. The floor, beneath the door, was covered in footprints. They weren't just any footprints. They were fresh, wet, leaving smudges of pale white behind. They were headed straight toward me. I spun around, my mind racing. There was no other exit. No other way out. The room was locked tight, the windows were boarded up, and now those footsteps were closing in on me. I stepped back, pressing my back against the wall again, my head swimming. I could hear the soft shuffle of those footsteps, just outside the door, just beyond my reach. And they were getting closer. Knock. 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 The door rattled again. I had to get away. I turned toward the farthest corner, my eyes frantically scanning the room for any other escape. But there was nothing. Nothing but the door, the footprints, and the growing sense that I was not alone. That I had never been alone. I heard another knock, this time more forceful. Knock. Knock. The door groaned, the wood straining under the pressure, like something was trying to break through. I couldn't move. And then I heard a voice. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere. It was low, distorted, but unmistakably familiar. My own voice echoing in the silence. You can't escape. The words sent a chill down my spine, paralyzing me with fear. I looked around, but there was no one. Only the door, the footprints, and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. You can't escape. I felt my legs give out beneath me as the words repeated over and over again. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. My mouth was full of cotton. And then the door burst open. The hallway was filled with people. The people in white. They stood in the doorway, their cold eyes staring at me, unmoving. Their expressions were vacant, unfeeling. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just stared. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't meant to escape. I was never meant to escape. The figures in white didn't move at first. They simply stood there, silent, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The air grew heavier, as if the room itself had taken a deep, unsettling breath. My mind raced, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. The people in the doorway didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence filled the space, overwhelming me, suffocating me. I tried to make a sound, tried to speak, but no words came. My throat was dry, tight, as if it too had been sealed shut. I backed away, pressing myself into the farthest corner of the room, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. I needed to get out. I needed to run. But the doorway, the only possible escape, was filled with them, standing still, watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, even when I closed my own. It was as if they were inside my head, pulling the strings of my thoughts, of my very existence. The silence between us stretched on, suffocating, unbearable. Then, one of them stepped forward. The sound of soft, shuffling footsteps echoed in the room as they moved toward me. It was deliberate, slow, calculated. With every step, my fear grew. The distance between us seemed to vanish, and I could almost feel the air grow colder, heavier. When they reached me, I instinctively shrank back, my body tensing as if to flee. But the person in white didn't reach out to touch me. No, they only stood before me, their heads slightly tilted as if studying me, as if trying to understand something that was too difficult to comprehend. Their eyes, they were hollow. Empty. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The air felt thick, like I was breathing in something foul, something that wasn't air at all. I could taste it in my mouth, a bitter, metallic tang, like rust. Then, another voice. You cannot leave. It was soft, almost a whisper, but the words resonated in the pit of my stomach. My skin crawled as the voice seemed to come from all around me, from every corner of the room, from the very walls themselves. The people in white didn't speak again. They simply watched, their cold eyes never leaving me. And I realized, then, that they weren't just watching me, they were waiting for me to do something. To break. My mind raced, panic flooding my every thought. I had to escape. I had to find a way out, but my body felt frozen, paralyzed. I tried to push myself up, but my legs were weak, as if they were no longer my own. The footsteps continued to echo around the room, a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I glanced at the door again. It was still wide open, yet there was no sign of escape. More figures in white were filling the hallway, blocking every possible route. Their faces, their eyes, they were everywhere. I could feel it then, the pull of something deeper, darker. The room felt as though it were closing in on me, the walls pressing in tighter with each breath. It wasn't just the people in white, it was the entire city. The air, the buildings, the ground beneath me, it was all part of this. All part of whatever this was. You are here now, the voice whispered again. You belong here. The words felt wrong, foreign. They didn't make sense. And yet, at the same time, they felt familiar. As if they had always been part of me, buried deep inside, waiting to be unearthed. The room was growing darker, the light flickering and dimming. The air, thick with an oppressive silence, seemed to vibrate with an energy I couldn't understand. The faces of the people in white grew sharper in the shadows, their hollow eyes like empty wells, drawing me in. I felt the urge to turn around, to face them, to acknowledge them, as though by doing so, I could break free of this, whatever this was. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to look them in the eye, to let myself fall further into this nightmare. I tried to speak again, tried to shout, to beg for someone, anyone, to help me. But no sound came from my mouth. I felt a strange, cold numbness spread through my limbs. My hands, my legs, they weren't mine anymore. They were becoming part of this room, part of this world where everything was white, and silence was the only language. I wanted to scream, but there was nothing left inside me to scream with. The walls around me pulsed with a sickening rhythm, as though the entire room was alive, breathing, swallowing me whole. Then, as if by some unspoken command, the people in white began to move. Slowly, in perfect unison, they closed the distance between us, surrounding me, encircling me. They moved so quietly, so methodically, that it was as though they had no need to make a sound. They just were. And then, one by one, they began to kneel. I felt the weight of their presence press in, felt the air thicken around me as they lowered themselves to the floor. And as they did, I realized with a sickening clarity, this wasn't a city. This wasn't a world. This was a place, a space, where time had no meaning, where existence itself had no purpose. I was the only thing that didn't belong here. And that's when I understood. I wasn't trapped. I was being replaced. I hadn't wandered into some alternate reality or another dimension. I had wandered into something far worse, a reflection of my own mind, twisted and broken. The people in white weren't strangers. They were me. I was becoming them. I could feel it now, seeping into my bones. Their cold eyes, their empty faces, they were becoming my own. Their silence, their unfeeling gaze, it was all I had left now. And as I collapsed to the ground, surrounded by the endless sea of white, I realized there was no escape. I had become part of it. And I always would be. The last of my strength slipped away as I lay on the cold floor, my mind swirling with confusion and terror. The people in white surrounded me, their presence suffocating, their stillness unnerving. The space I was in, this room, this city, no longer felt like something I could escape. It felt like something I had always been a part of, a place where there was no beginning and no end, only an endless loop of silence and observation. I tried to move, to scream, to do anything to break free from this, but my body refused to obey. It was as if my very essence had been drained, leaving me hollow. My hands trembled, but they no longer felt like mine. The skin was cold, stiff, and strangely smooth. I didn't recognize the reflection I saw in my own eyes as they stared back at me from the floor, those empty, unfeeling eyes. "You are here," the voice whispered again, but now it wasn't distant. It was inside me, speaking through my own thoughts, as though it had always been there, waiting. "You belong here now." I wanted to deny it, to scream that this wasn't me, that I was still me, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't speak. The silence had consumed me, and with it, every last trace of who I had been. The people in white began to rise. Their movements were fluid, synchronized, as though they had rehearsed this for years. No longer kneeling, they stood over me now, their heads tilted in unison, as if waiting for my response. But I had nothing left to give. I was no longer afraid. I couldn't remember what fear felt like. The emotions that once defined me, hope, despair, confusion, had all faded into the vast emptiness around me. The void had swallowed them whole, leaving me with nothing but a strange sense of calm resignation. One of the figures, the one closest to me, reached down. Their hand, pale and smooth, hovered just above my own, almost as if offering something. I felt the pull again, the same pull I had felt the moment I had entered this place. It wasn't an external force. It was inside me, deep within, like a call I couldn't ignore. The figure's hand pressed lightly against my own, and for a moment, I felt a spark, a faint pulse of warmth in the otherwise cold room. But it wasn't real warmth. It was a memory. A forgotten sensation. The figure didn't speak, but I heard it. "You will become one of us." And just like that, I understood. There was no escaping it. This wasn't a prison. It wasn't punishment. This was transformation. I had been consumed by this place, by the silence, by the void that stretched on forever. And now, there was no me left. There was only the person in white, standing motionless in this endless sea of emptiness. I felt my breath slow, my thoughts dull, as the last remnants of my identity slipped away. I no longer had a name, a purpose, a past. I was part of them now. I had always been part of them. As I stood up, my body moving in perfect synchrony with the others, I looked out at the endless white void before me. The city was gone, the people were gone. There was only the silence now, and the knowledge that I had become what I once feared. The last trace of who I had been disappeared as I joined the others, walking in perfect step, endlessly repeating the same motion. And with it, all that was left was silence. It was late one evening when I found the photos. I had been sitting on my porch, trying to shake off the weight of a long workday, when a package appeared on the steps. It was odd, no note, no return address. Just an unmarked brown envelope. At first, I thought it was some mistake, perhaps a delivery for the neighbors, but when I opened it, I was stunned. Inside were several photographs of my house, taken at night. The images were crisp and clear, but what caught my eye wasn't just the quality, it was the fact that none of these photographs had been taken by anyone in my family. The camera used was newer, far more advanced than anything I owned. It wasn't a simple snapshot of my home from the street or the front yard either. These were close, too close, taken at angles that suggested someone had been standing at the foot of my driveway, just out of sight. The first photograph was of my house's front door, illuminated only by the pale glow of a street lamp. The second was taken from a dark corner of the yard where the faint outlines of trees blurred against the shadows. The third was a picture of my bedroom window, my wife's half-open curtains swaying in the night breeze. I stared at the pictures, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. It was unsettling, knowing that someone had been so close without my knowledge. But what made my blood run cold was the fourth photo. It was of me. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book by the dim light of the lamp. The photo had been taken through the window. The glass was so clear, I could see the subtle distortion of the image as the lens had captured my reflection in the window pane. But the odd thing was, this photo had been taken hours after I had turned off all the lights, after I had locked the doors, and after I was sure no one could have been watching. I stared at the photo, trying to make sense of it, trying to find an explanation. But nothing made sense. The more I looked, the more I felt like I was being swallowed by some dark, creeping realization. I wasn't alone. Someone had been here, watching, and they knew everything about me, where I sat, what time I went to bed, the exact angle from which they could photograph me undetected. I could feel my pulse quicken. My mind raced as I tried to think of anyone who might have had access to my home. But there was no one. No one had been near my house. Who could have done this? The question echoed in my mind as I stepped away from the photos, trying to calm myself. But it was impossible. The fear was real. I wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the idea that someone had been spying on me for days, or that they had left these photos as a warning, an invitation to do more. The wind picked up outside, rustling the leaves in the trees. My eyes darted to the empty street, the quiet darkness swallowing the light from the porch. My mind wandered to the last photo again, the one with me in it. Was I being watched even now? Was someone outside, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to notice? A sound. A slight creak from the porch. I froze. I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself it was just the wind, but the feeling didn't go away. I slowly turned toward the door, my heart pounding. There was no one there, of course. No one standing in the yard or peering from the shadows. But somehow, I knew they were close. I picked up the photos again and quickly slid them back into the envelope, my hands shaking. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I couldn't just ignore it. This wasn't something I could brush off. I had to find out who was behind this, and why they had been watching me. The questions kept spinning in my mind, tightening around my chest like a vice. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something far darker than just a simple intrusion. There was something off about all of it. Something wrong. And as I turned to head inside, I couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was waiting for me. Waiting for me to make the next move. I wasn't sure what was worse, the photos, or the sense that this was only the beginning. The following morning, I woke up with a tightness in my chest that hadn't been there the night before. The photos sat in the envelope on the table, but my thoughts were clouded. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a prank, a sick joke, maybe a neighbor playing some twisted game. But as I looked around my house, nothing felt familiar anymore. The walls that once comforted me seemed cold, as if they were closing in. I took the photos with me to work, not knowing what to do with them, but unable to leave them behind. Maybe I could show someone with experience in this kind of thing, someone who could explain it away. But the more I looked at them, the more I realized there was no explanation. How could anyone explain a photo of me, sitting in my own living room, hours after I thought I was alone? That night, after a long day, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house. The darkness outside felt oppressive, and I was certain that someone was still watching, waiting for me to make a move. I took a walk, trying to clear my mind, but every step felt like I was being pulled into a web I couldn't escape. The quiet streets seemed endless, the houses lining the road still and unblinking, as though they were waiting for something. The photos were still in my jacket pocket, heavy and undeniable. I had to know more. I had to find out who was behind this. But how? As I walked, a figure caught my eye, a person standing in front of my house, standing so still it was like they were part of the night itself. The figure was dressed in black, their features obscured by the shadows, but I could see the faint glint of something in their hand. A camera, perhaps? My heart raced, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run toward them, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. And then, as if on cue, they turned and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow, my mind reeling. Was it the same person? The one who had been taking the photos? The thought of confronting them made my stomach churn, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I walked back home, my pace quickening with every step. When I reached my front door, I didn't pause. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. But the unsettling feeling didn't fade. It only grew stronger. I went to the window and peered through the blinds, scanning the yard for any signs of movement. The street was still, as it always was at night. But something was off. My gaze landed on the edge of the yard, where the shadows seemed darker, thicker than they should have been. There was no figure, no movement, but the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Suddenly, I heard a noise. A soft scrape just outside the door. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. Someone was outside. My heart pounded as I moved slowly toward the door. I reached for the handle, but as my fingers brushed against it, I stopped. What if they were already inside? What if this had all been a trap? The thought paralyzed me, but I couldn't stay inside forever. I had to face whatever was out there. I opened the door, cautiously, the darkness swallowing me whole as I stepped into the night. The cold air felt sharp against my skin, and every sound, the distant hum of a car, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified, as if the world had grown suddenly too loud. I stepped down the porch stairs, my breath clouding in the air. There was nothing in sight. No figure, no shadow. Just the stillness of the night. But then, I saw it. A camera. Lying on the ground, half hidden beneath the bushes near my porch. I walked over and picked it up, my hands trembling. It was sleek and modern, nothing like the old camera I owned. I turned it on, hoping to find some clue, but the screen remained black. There was no sign of the person who had left it. But I knew they had been here. The camera was a message, a taunt. And then, as I stared down at the camera, I noticed something else. The lens wasn't just a lens. It was too clear. There was something inside it. A reflection. It was me, standing in the yard, holding the camera. But what struck me was the figure behind me. The same person, the same figure from earlier, standing in the shadows, watching. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was no one there. Only the cold night air. I stood frozen, staring into the empty yard, my mind racing. Had they been watching me all this time? Had they left me this camera to remind me that I wasn't alone? The answer came slowly, sinking in like ice in my veins. There was no escaping this. I had become part of whatever twisted game they were playing, and I didn't know how to win. I couldn't sleep that night. The camera sat on the table, its cold, polished surface reflecting the faint glow of the streetlight outside. I had locked all the windows, double-checked the doors, but I still felt exposed. It was as if the shadows themselves were watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just out of sight, always there, always present. The silence in the house was oppressive. Every small sound, every creak of the floorboards, made my heart race. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining someone standing at the foot of my bed, watching, just as they had before. The photo of me in the living room, the one taken through the window, played over and over in my mind. How did they know where I would be? How had they known I'd be alone? I had to know more. The next morning, I went to work, but the unease never left me. It gnawed at the back of my mind, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching. Every face I passed on the street seemed like a potential threat. Every car that drove by felt like it might stop, that it might contain a person who had been stalking me for days or longer. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I needed answers. I needed to confront whatever was happening, but I wasn't sure where to start. The camera, what did it mean? What was the purpose of leaving it in my yard? The more I thought about it, the less I understood. I picked up the camera again, turning it over in my hands. There had to be something, some clue. But the screen was still blank, unyielding, as if mocking my desperation. Then, I noticed something strange. A small, almost invisible button on the side of the camera. It wasn't a power button, this one was different. I pressed it without thinking, and the screen flickered to life. A video. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I watched the footage play. It was me. The video was from the same perspective as the photo, the one of me sitting in my living room, reading a book. But the camera angle was different. It wasn't just from outside my window. This time, the camera was inside the house. And I could see myself, sitting there, unaware of the lens watching me. But that wasn't the worst part. As I watched, a figure slowly emerged from the shadows in the corner of the room. They were tall, draped in black, their features hidden beneath a hood. They moved silently, almost fluidly, as if they were part of the darkness itself. The figure reached out, close enough that their shadow stretched across my form. Then, with a sickening slowness, they placed a hand on my shoulder. I gasped, my heart stopping for a second. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. This was just a video, a trick of the light, a warped moment captured on film. But something inside me screamed that it wasn't a trick. I rewound the video, watching it again. And again. The figure in the shadows. The hand on my shoulder. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They had been here. Inside my house. Watching me, as if they were waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. I looked around, my mind spiraling into panic. The walls seemed to close in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the video was still here, somewhere in the house, hidden, watching. But the house was empty. I grabbed the camera, my fingers cold against its smooth surface, and ran to the front door. I swung it open, not caring who or what might be waiting for me outside. But there was nothing. The street was quiet. The world was still. I stepped onto the porch, my heart pounding. The night air was thick, suffocating, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I looked down the street, searching for movement, any sign of someone watching, but there was nothing. No one. The silence was unbearable. The video was still playing in my mind, looping over and over, each time more vivid than the last. The figure had been inside my house. They had been so close, too close. They had touched me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whoever was doing this, whoever was behind the camera, they weren't just watching. They were trying to send a message. But what? I turned back into the house, my mind racing. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. I grabbed my phone and tried to dial the police, but the screen remained frozen. No signal. My heart sank. The house felt like it was suffocating me. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they all seemed to be pressing in, closing off the world. I couldn't escape. I ran to the back door, hoping to get some air, to find some sense of relief. But as soon as I opened it, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing just outside the door, was the figure from the video. They were real. And they were here. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure stood motionless in the dim light of the backyard, cloaked in shadows, their face hidden beneath a dark hood. For a moment, I questioned my own senses. Was this real? Could it be the product of my fear, my paranoia? But no, there was no denying it. The figure in front of me was no figment of imagination. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. They simply stood there, as if waiting for something, as if they had all the time in the world. My pulse hammered in my ears, and every inch of me screamed for me to run, but my feet were cemented to the ground. My mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, none of them making any sense. How long had they been watching me? How much did they know? And what did they want? The figure finally stirred, taking a slow step forward. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, barely able to keep my balance. Every instinct I had told me to run, to get out of there, but something deeper held me in place. A primal fear. A knowing that there was no escaping this, no matter how far I ran. Who are you? I managed to croak, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. They simply continued to move forward, each step deliberate, precise. A cold, suffocating air seemed to follow them, like a shadow stretching further with every inch they closed between us. I wanted to close the door, to lock myself inside, but the doorframe felt too far for me to reach. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, unable to escape the suffocating presence of this thing in my backyard. The only sound was the crunch of the gravel beneath their boots. With each step, I felt the ground beneath me give way. The darkness around me deepened, the air thickening as if the very atmosphere was becoming alive, pressing in on me. And then, just as the figure was inches from me, close enough that I could feel the cold of their presence, the air around me thick and heavy, the figure raised their hand. They weren't holding a weapon. No, the hand was extended, palm facing me, as if to stop me. But the movement was too deliberate, too practiced. And that's when I saw it, underneath the hood, the faintest glint of something in the darkness. A shadow inside the shadow. A face. But not just any face. A face I knew. My heart stopped. My breath caught in my throat. It was impossible. It couldn't be. But it was. The face in the shadows was my own. I stumbled back, a cold wave of dread crashing over me. The figure, whoever or whatever they were, was me. But not in the way I expected. It was a twisted version, a mirror image, but one that was contorted and wrong. Their face was stretched, eyes dark and hollow, a cold smile playing across their lips. I could feel my knees weaken, my body shaking uncontrollably. The air around me buzzed with an electric hum, and I realized, with an undeniable sense of horror, that I wasn't just looking at a reflection of myself. I was looking at something that had somehow become me, or had taken my place. Why? I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel it, the presence, the oppressive weight of their gaze, of their silence. I was suffocating, trapped in a world I didn't understand. Every inch of my skin prickled, every muscle in my body screamed to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The figure raised their hand higher, and I realized, with growing terror, that they were reaching for me. A chill ran down my spine as their fingers, pale and cold as death, extended toward me. I had no choice. I turned and bolted for the door, my legs barely able to carry me. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with frantic hands, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break free from my chest. I leaned against the door, gasping for air, praying, hoping that when I turned around, the nightmare would be gone. But it wasn't. I stumbled backward, my eyes wide in disbelief. The figure from the backyard was inside my house, standing in the living room. They had followed me, and somehow they had entered without a sound. Ow! I gasped. The figure didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes, my eyes, spoke for them. Empty. Hollow. There was nothing behind them. I backed away, step by trembling step. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, the same way they had in the backyard, closing the distance between us. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. But my body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. They reached out. I felt the coldness of their hand, a sharp, biting chill that burned through my skin. I gasped, but the figure didn't flinch, didn't pull away. They only smiled, their twisted, warped face giving no comfort, no relief. The room spun around me, and for a moment everything blurred. The edges of my vision darkened, and I felt like I was being pulled into something darker, something far worse than I had ever imagined. I was losing control. And then, just before I collapsed, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The camera, sitting on the table. The same camera that had captured me, that had captured the figure. I realized too late. The figure wasn't just watching me. They were controlling me. The room felt like it was collapsing in on me. My heart raced, and my breath became shallow as I tried to focus on the figure in front of me. The cold hand still gripped my arm, its icy touch seeping into my skin, paralyzing me further. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense anymore. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to run, to break free from whatever this was. But the figure, my reflection, held me in place with an unnatural force, their hollow eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that drained the very will from my body. I barely noticed when the camera clicked. It was faint at first, a distant sound I could have easily dismissed. But then it came again, a sharp, deliberate snap. The air grew even colder, the weight of it pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I turned my head, only for my gaze to land on the camera on the table. The same camera that had captured the strange photographs of my house, the photographs I had found on my doorstep. The camera wasn't just a tool for documenting what had happened, it was a part of the curse, a conduit for whatever force had taken hold of my life. And I realized, with mounting horror, that the figure, it wasn't just mimicking me. It was controlling me. Each move I made, each breath I took, was being observed, manipulated. The clicks of the camera weren't just recordings, they were commands. I looked back at the figure. My reflection, no, not my reflection, it was smiling, the twisted, hollow grin never leaving its face. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing on me, crushing me from all sides. My own body felt foreign, as if I no longer controlled it. A sudden, horrible thought pierced my mind. What if this was happening to everyone? What if this was how it had gotten in here, how it had found me? Was I the only one who had realized what was going on? Or were there others, out there, trapped in the same nightmare? The camera clicked again. I heard it clearly this time, the sound of the shutter, sharp and final. I was losing myself. The figure in front of me seemed to grow taller, more menacing, its presence stretching across the room. My hands shook uncontrollably as I tried to pull away, but it was no use. The force of its grip was too strong. The figure reached into the folds of its cloak. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, trapped by the weight of the fear that held me in place. The figure pulled something from its cloak, a photograph. It was a picture of me. I looked at it, my eyes wide in disbelief. It was a photograph of me, standing exactly where I was now, with the same wide-eyed expression of terror that I was wearing in that very moment. But there was one difference. In the photograph, I was smiling. A cruel, twisted smile that didn't belong to me. The figure held the photograph up, letting me see it, then slowly, deliberately, it turned it over. There, on the back, was a message written in dark ink. "This is who you've become." The words hit me like a physical blow. My chest tightened, and my mind reeled. Was this true? Was this really happening? I glanced back at the figure. Its smile widened, as if it could sense my growing terror. The camera clicked again. This time, the sound was followed by the softest of whispers, a voice that seemed to come from all around me, not from the figure itself, but from somewhere deeper, from the very air in the room. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed. "You are already part of it." I wanted to scream. I wanted to deny it. But deep inside, I felt the truth of those words settle into the very core of my being. I had been trapped long before I even realized it. The photographs, the figure, the camera, all of it was part of a game I hadn't understood until now. A game where the rules were never in my favor. I reached for the camera, my hands trembling, the desire to destroy it overwhelming. If I could just break it, destroy the source of all this, maybe I could regain control. Maybe I could find a way out. But before I could touch it, the figure stepped forward, blocking my path. It reached out, not with its hand, but with the camera itself. The lens glinted in the dim light, and I felt an icy jolt shoot through my body as if the camera's gaze was cutting through me, erasing me. The figure smiled, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in its eyes, something darker, more malevolent. "You were never in control," it whispered, its voice smooth and suffocating. "You only thought you were." I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the realization hit me all at once. The photographs, the figure, the camera, it wasn't just observing me. It had been shaping me, guiding me, pushing me toward this moment. The moment when I would realize that I was nothing more than a part of the picture, a subject to be captured, to be controlled. And as the figure raised the camera one last time, I knew with absolute certainty that there was no escaping. I was already part of the photograph. The click of the camera echoed one final time. I don't know how long we've been driving. Hours? Days? Time doesn't seem to matter here, not when the road stretches out endlessly ahead of us, and the same monotonous scenery repeats itself over and over. It's as if we're caught in a loop, but I can't remember when it started, or if it even did start. The trees lining the road look identical every time we pass them, the same shape, the same hue, and the same faint movement in the wind. It's unnerving. I glance over at Emily, my wife, sitting next to me. Her face is pale, her eyes tired and distant, but there's something more, an underlying tension in her posture, her clenched fists on her lap. She's noticed it too. She hasn't said anything, but I know she feels it. We both do. That sense of dread creeping under the surface, gnawing at our sanity. Something's not right, I say quietly, my voice breaking the silence in the car. She doesn't respond immediately. Her eyes stay fixed on the road ahead, but I see her grip tighten on the steering wheel. She's trying to ignore it. We both are. We've been trying to push the growing unease to the back of our minds, hoping that if we keep driving, we'll eventually find our way out. But every turn leads us back to the same place. The same stretch of highway. The same trees. The same sky that never seems to change. I can't remember when it happened, when our car's battery started draining. The headlights flicker occasionally, and the radio gives off static every now and then. It's almost like the whole car is alive, responding to something we can't see. Emily tried calling for help, but there's no signal. The phone is useless, just like everything else. Should we stop? Emily asks, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder would shatter the fragile calm that's hanging between us. I glance at the dashboard. The fuel gauge is stuck at half full, despite the fact that we've been driving for far longer than we should have. The battery is low, too. I reach for the gear stick, my hand trembling. Let's just keep going a little longer. We're both afraid to stop, because somehow we know that if we do, the road will keep going, pulling us into its never-ending loop. There's no end to it, no way to break free. Not unless we... The thought dies in my mind as a strange noise cuts through the quiet. At first, I think it's just the wind or the creak of the car's suspension. But then I hear it again, a faint, rhythmic sound, like someone walking just outside the car. My heart stops. I glance at Emily, but she's looking straight ahead, her expression frozen. Did you hear that? I ask, my voice barely above a whisper. She doesn't reply. Instead, she speeds up, as if trying to outrun the noise. But the sound continues, a faint tapping of footsteps, too close, too deliberate. I turn my head, trying to see through the rearview mirror, but the darkness outside the car is thick. I can't make out anything beyond the dim reflection of the dashboard lights. The footsteps grow louder. It's like someone is pacing behind the car, just out of sight. My stomach twists with a cold, creeping fear. Emily, I say, this time more urgently. We need to stop. We need to see. She cuts me off, her voice sharp and panicked. No. Keep going. But it's too late. I know that whatever is out there, whatever is walking behind us, has already found us. And no matter how fast we drive, it won't let us go. The footsteps seem to move in sync with the car, as if whatever is out there is keeping pace with us. Each tap of a footfall is like a countdown, the seconds ticking away in the most horrifying way. My pulse quickens, my breath shortens. My thoughts spiral out of control. Emily, stop the car. I shout, but my voice cracks, full of terror. She slams on the brakes. The car screeches to a halt, the tires protesting against the endless stretch of pavement. The footsteps stop too. Silence falls like a heavy blanket, suffocating and complete. For a moment, there's nothing but the sound of our shallow breathing. Do you hear it? I ask again, my voice trembling. The footsteps, they're still here. Emily's hands shake as she turns off the engine. The headlights go dark, and the silence that follows feels like it's closing in on us. Then, from the darkness, I hear it again. A slow, deliberate tap, 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 as if someone is pacing around the car. We sit frozen in the dark, listening, waiting. But there's no escape. The tapping grows louder, more insistent, and now I can hear something else, something far worse than just footsteps. A low, rasping breath. It's coming from outside the car, from somewhere near the driver's side. My heart hammers in my chest, and I feel my hands start to sweat, slick against the cold steering wheel. Emily, I whisper, my voice hoarse. Do you hear that? She doesn't answer. I can see her out of the corner of my eye, her face ashen, her hands trembling on her lap. I don't know if she's even breathing. She's too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. I feel it too, the cold that's creeping into the car, not from the outside air, but from something far more sinister. It's as if the very air inside the car is pressing in on us, squeezing the life out of the space. The tapping starts again. Closer now. So close, I can almost feel the vibrations on the metal frame of the car. My mind races. Should I look out the window? Should I open the door and confront whatever it is? But the idea of what could be out there paralyzes me. I stay still, praying that whatever it is doesn't know I'm inside, praying that it will just go away if I don't move. The rasping breath becomes clearer now. It's slow, deliberate, like someone is trying to stay hidden, trying not to give away their position. And then, a whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. It's a voice, one I don't recognize. It's soft, almost soothing, but there's something wrong with it. The words don't make sense, they slither into my mind like a nightmare. You can't leave, it says. There is no way out. My skin prickles with fear. I glance over at Emily, hoping she's heard it too, hoping I'm not losing my mind. Her eyes are wide, locked on the darkness outside the car, as if she can see something I can't. And then, in an instant, the tapping stops. The breath stops. The whisper is gone. There's only silence now. But I know it's not real silence. It's the kind of silence that suffocates, that presses against your eardrums and fills the space with a horrible weight. It feels like the world itself is holding its breath, waiting. Emily, I say again, my voice cracking. What the hell is going on? What is this? She doesn't answer, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I wonder if she's heard the voice too. I glance at her, and my stomach drops. She's staring ahead, her lips slightly parted, as if in a trance. She's not looking at anything, just staring into the nothingness of the night. Emily? I shake her by the shoulder, desperate to break her out of whatever spell she's under. She blinks slowly, her eyes refocusing. For a moment, she looks confused, but then the realization hits. She knows. It's not real, she whispers, her voice hollow. None of this is real. We're not going anywhere. We're stuck here. Her words chill me to the bone. The weight of what she's saying settles in, and I feel the creeping panic surge through my veins. We've been trapped. There is no road out. No escape. Suddenly, the car's engine sputters back to life, a violent jolt that shakes the entire vehicle. I can feel the car moving again, even though we haven't touched the accelerator. It's as if the car itself is driving, pulling us further into the endless night. The road ahead stretches on, forever looping back into itself, like some cruel joke. I try to look out the window, but all I can see is darkness. There's nothing beyond the glass. We're going in circles, I whisper, not sure if I'm speaking to her or to myself. We've been here before. This road. We've been on this road for hours, for days, for weeks. My voice breaks. Emily doesn't say anything. She just sits there, her face pale, her eyes empty. It's as if she's already given up. The darkness presses in from all sides now, thickening, swirling, turning the world outside into an inky void. The trees are gone. The road is gone. There's only the car, moving forward in an endless loop, and the suffocating silence, punctuated by the occasional whispering breath outside, the tapping steps that never seem to stop. I want to scream. I want to claw my way out of this nightmare. But no sound comes from my throat. The fear is too much. We're caught in something we can't understand, something that's beyond us. And as the road stretches on, I realize there's no end. There's no escape. Not now. Not ever. And then, just as the despair sets in, I hear it again, the whisper. One more lap, it says. And with that, the car drives on into the darkness, into the endless road, and the nightmare continues. The road never ends. It stretches into the horizon, a ribbon of asphalt that seems to fold back on itself, like a cruel trick, forcing us to drive endlessly, to relive the same nightmare again and again. I don't know how long we've been driving now. Minutes? Hours? It feels like time has stopped, as though the world around us is trapped in a loop, just like the road. My hands are still clenched on the steering wheel, but they're numb now, a part of me that's detached from reality. Emily hasn't spoken since the whisper, since the moment she said we were stuck. Her eyes are distant, unblinking. She doesn't even seem to be looking at anything anymore. She's just there. Like a hollow shell, waiting for something that will never come. The car is the only thing that moves. The engine hums steadily beneath us, the tires rolling over the road with an unnerving rhythm. Every now and then, I hear the tapping again. A soft, deliberate sound coming from the dark outside. It's not the same as before, not the same as the breath or the whisper, but something else, something just as sinister. A tapping that sounds too close, too deliberate, too intentional. I turn my head slightly, glancing at Emily. Her face is drawn, pale, her lips trembling. Emily, I say again, my voice barely a whisper. Do you feel that? Do you hear it? She doesn't respond. She doesn't even look at me. She's lost. I can feel it. I try to reach out, but my hand stops halfway, as if something is holding me back, stopping me from touching her. A strange force, something beyond the ordinary, like the very air in this car is thickening, turning against us. Then, the car jerks forward, a sudden lurch that makes my stomach twist. The headlights flicker, and for a brief, horrifying moment, everything goes dark. For a second, the car is weightless, floating in the void of nothingness. I slam my foot on the brake, but nothing happens. The car continues to move, gliding forward in the darkness. And then the headlights flash back on. The road is gone. There is no more asphalt beneath us, no trees or landscape or horizon. Just darkness. Endless, empty darkness. I'm gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles are white, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. What is happening? Where are we? I press my foot down again, desperately trying to speed up, to escape whatever this is, but it's no use. The car moves forward on its own, as if we're being pulled by some unseen force. Emily! I shout, turning to her in panic, but she still doesn't respond. Her eyes are wide open, staring into the nothingness, her body unmoving. The tapping grows louder again, more distinct. I can feel it now, too. It's not coming from the outside of the car anymore. It's coming from somewhere inside. It's as if someone is tapping on the window beside me, soft at first, but with each passing second, the sound grows more urgent, more desperate. And the breath, there's that breath again, coming from the same place, rasping in the silence. It's too close. Too close. I glance out the window. My breath catches in my throat. I see a shadow moving, faint at first, but it's there. A figure, tall and dark, walking just outside the car. The tapping is its footsteps, the breath its labored gasps. It's walking alongside us, never stopping, never speeding up, just keeping pace. I swallow hard. What do you want? I whisper, though I know it can't hear me. But then, the figure stops. And for the first time, I feel the full weight of its presence. It's not just walking beside us, it's watching us. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, are fixed on me through the window. There's something wrong with them, too large, too wide, too unblinking. I freeze. My breath catches in my throat. It's not real. It can't be. But it is. I can see it. I can feel it. I try to reach for the door, to escape, but my hand shakes uncontrollably. The fear is so thick, it suffocates me. The tapping continues, louder now. The figure steps closer, pressing its face to the window, its eyes never leaving mine. And I know, in that moment, that whatever it is, it's waiting for something. Waiting for us to stop. Waiting for us to accept the truth that we are stuck here. Forever. The darkness deepens. The figure doesn't move. Its eyes remain locked on mine, unwavering, as if daring me to look away. The tapping, once a mere sound in the distance, now reverberates through the car, relentless and maddening. Each tap feels like it's digging into my skull, like it's pulling at something deep inside me. I can't escape it. I can't escape it. I slam my foot on the accelerator, desperate to move forward, but the car is frozen in place. It doesn't matter how hard I press down. The wheels spin, but there's no motion. We are stuck in this never-ending loop, trapped in this darkness with that thing, that figure outside our window. Emily, I whisper again, but she still doesn't respond. Her eyes are wide, staring straight ahead, but I know she's not seeing anything. There's nothing here. There's just the road. The same road. The same unchanging darkness. My fingers are slick with sweat, gripping the wheel so tightly that my hands are starting to ache. I feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, suffocating me. I glance back at the figure. It's still standing there, just outside the window, motionless but watching. The glow from its eyes seems to pulse, dimming and brightening like it's breathing. The tapping stops. For a moment, I think I might have imagined it, but then the air shifts. The temperature drops. A coldness seeps through the car, creeping along my skin. It's so cold that I can see my breath fogging in front of me, even though the heater is on full blast. I look to the rearview mirror, but the darkness behind us is thick, impenetrable. Then I hear it, a whisper. Soft at first, but growing louder until it's all I can hear. Come out. Come out and play. The words send a jolt through me, cold dread twisting in my stomach. I look at Emily, her face still blank, her lips trembling. Emily, please. Please, say something, I beg, my voice cracking. We need to get out of here. We need to. The car jerks again, as though something is shaking it from the outside. The force is strong enough that the seatbelt digs into my chest, but it's not enough to make us move. We are still stuck, still trapped. And then the whisper grows louder, the words clearer now. You cannot run. You cannot hide. The figure outside the window is moving again, but this time it's not walking beside the car. It's moving in front of us, circling, its movements slow, deliberate. Every step it takes makes the darkness feel thicker, more suffocating. I can feel it, pressing on me, closing the space between us. I glance around desperately, searching for something, anything, that could help. The car, the headlights, none of it makes sense anymore. There's no sign of the road we were driving on. There are no trees, no signs, no landmarks. Just a black void, endless and oppressive. Please, I beg, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles feel like they might snap. Emily, wake up. We need to leave. We need to get away from it. But she remains silent, her eyes hollow. She's not even blinking anymore. I can see it now, the faint, eerie light that glows behind her pupils. Her eyes, they're not hers. They're something else. The tapping starts again. It's louder this time, closer, as if whatever is making the noise is inside the car now. My heart races. I look around, panic flooding my chest. But I see nothing. No one. Just the two of us. Or at least, it should be. Tap. 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 It's coming from behind me. I don't dare look. But then I hear it again, a slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep. I know that sound. I know it because I heard it once before, years ago. It was the sound my grandmother made when she used to walk through the old house at night. The sound that always followed me, no matter where I went, even though she died years ago. Tap. 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 I turn around in a blur of motion, and that's when I see it. Not in the back seat, not behind the car, but in the mirror. A face. A dark, twisted face, just inches from mine. It's almost like a reflection, but not quite. The features are distorted, the skin pale and sickly, eyes too wide, too empty. And then I hear it again, the whisper, the voice that's been echoing in my head for what feels like forever. You can't escape. You're already here. I turn back to the road, my hands trembling, the engine whining in protest. But the darkness is everywhere now, swallowing the car whole. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know what's happening. But I can feel the weight of it pressing on my chest, pulling me down into the suffocating blackness. Emily. Please, we have to do something, I whisper, but my voice cracks, and the words come out as nothing more than a faint echo in the dark. The car shudders again. This time, the whisper doesn't stop. It keeps coming, swirling around us like a storm. And I realize, with a chilling certainty, that the tapping is not just on the outside anymore. It's inside. It's everywhere. The tapping continues. Relentless. It's everywhere now, in every crevice of the car, in the very air I breathe. My breath comes in ragged gasps as I desperately search for some way out of this nightmare. The headlights barely cut through the suffocating darkness, and the road doesn't change. It's the same stretch of empty highway we've been driving down for what feels like hours, maybe days. I can't tell anymore. Why won't it end? I scream, my voice hoarse, cracking from the pressure in my chest. But there's no answer. Only the tapping, louder now, growing as if the very universe is trying to break through. I feel the walls of the car closing in, the windows fogging up from the cold, and the silence hanging heavy, suffocating. The presence outside, behind the glass, feels closer now, its shape moving ever so slightly, like it's waiting for me to make a mistake. I try to look back at Emily, but she's not moving. Her face, as pale and lifeless as before, is a mirror of the horror I feel inside. What happened to her? What's happening to us? I shake her gently. Emily, wake up. Please, I need you. I can't do this alone. She doesn't respond. Her eyes remain fixed, staring ahead, unblinking, vacant. I slam my fist into the steering wheel, the sound deafening, but the car doesn't react. Nothing changes. And then, I hear it, the voice. Low, guttural, like it's coming from deep within the car, inside my head, inside my very soul. Turn around. I freeze. A chill crawls up my spine. My body goes rigid. I can't turn around. I already know what will be there, what I will see if I do. The figure. Its face. Those eyes. The tapping grows louder, more urgent. It's no longer a simple noise. It's a command. Turn around. I can't fight it anymore. Slowly, I turn my head, the motion stiff and unnatural. The darkness behind me is thicker than it was before, consuming everything in its path. But then I see it. Not in the back seat, not behind the car. It's reflected in the rearview mirror. The face. The face. It's so close. I can feel its presence, its eyes boring into me, its lips curled into a cruel smile. I gasp, but no sound escapes me. I'm paralyzed. The face is pressed against the mirror now, its features warped, its eyes black holes, empty and void of any emotion but hunger. It smiles, as though savoring my fear, as though it knows this is the moment I'll break. You can't escape. The voice is closer now, almost to my ear. I close my eyes, but it doesn't help. The tapping continues, louder and more chaotic. The figure outside the window has moved, and I can feel its shadow pressing against the glass. I try to speak, but my mouth is dry, my throat tight. There are no words, only silence. And then everything stops. The tapping, the whispers. The car is suddenly still. The air is thick, suffocating, pressing down on me. I dare not open my eyes. I don't know how long I sit there, frozen, terrified, but eventually I hear something, a sound so faint it barely reaches my ears at first. Come out and play. The voice is gentle, almost playful. It's so familiar. It sounds like Emily. But it's wrong. It's wrong. It's not her. I open my eyes. The figure is gone. The darkness is still there, but the figure, it's no longer pressing against the window. Then I see it. Emily's eyes are no longer empty. She's looking at me. But her eyes aren't filled with fear, like they should be. No, they're filled with something else. Something dark. Something that makes my blood run cold. It's too late. The words are barely a whisper, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. I can feel the weight of them. The reality of them. The crushing, suffocating truth. I turn to the wheel, desperately trying to start the car again. But the engine sputters, refusing to turn over. The lights flicker. And then, as if in response to my desperation, the car lurches forward, moving, but at an impossible speed. Faster and faster, the road blurring beneath us. The air is colder now, so cold I can see my breath in the fogged-up windows. But it's not the cold from outside. It's coming from within. The car is shaking, rattling as if it's coming apart at the seams. I look at Emily once more. Her eyes are still locked on mine, but there's no recognition left in them. No humanity. Only something else. Something dark. Something ombre. I scream. I beg for it to stop. I plead for it to end, for anything to make sense again. But there's nothing. The car speeds up, the road twisting, curving, stretching into an endless loop. And then, the crash. I wake up, but it's not a relief. It's a nightmare that never ends. The crash wasn't real. It didn't stop anything. The car, the road, the figure, they're still here, and so is Emily. Her eyes are still wide open, still staring at me, but there's no more life in them. Just endless, all emptiness. I know now. The road will never end. The tapping will never stop. And I will never escape. I'm trapped. In a loop. In a place that doesn't exist. The end is not an end. It's just a point in the circle. A circle that repeats. Forever. It was a quiet night. Too quiet, in fact. The kind of night when the streets seem empty even though the city is still awake. The streetlights flickered every now and then, casting long shadows across the road. As a taxi driver, I had seen my fair share of late-night fares, but this one was different. It started with a call from a woman. Her voice was soft, calm, almost too calm for the hour. She asked me to pick her up from the usual spot near the edge of town, close to the cemetery. I wasn't sure what was strange about the request at first. People get strange at night, and cemetery rides weren't all that uncommon in my line of work. I had driven more than one drunk person home after visiting a loved one's grave. But there was something in her voice that made me hesitate. "Are you sure you want to go there?" I asked as I pulled up to the curb. Yes, she said simply, her tone unshaken. It's the only place I need to go. I glanced in my rearview mirror as she stepped into the car. She was dressed in all black, her face pale, as though she hadn't seen the sun in days. Her eyes were strangely bright, almost luminous under the streetlights. I wanted to say something, to ask if she was okay, but I kept my mouth shut. The moment felt wrong. I drove in silence, the hum of the engine and the occasional soft swish of tires on wet asphalt the only sounds filling the car. The cemetery was a few miles out of the way, but it wasn't a long trip. It had been years since I had driven this route, and I hadn't missed it. The place always felt empty, like the kind of place where things, people, just disappeared. I know you don't like it, she spoke suddenly, breaking the silence. But it's where I belong. Her words chilled me. I glanced over at her, but she was staring out the window, as though she could see something far beyond the city lights. Why do you want to go there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to look at me, a small, sad smile crossing her face. I've been waiting for this ride for a long time. Her eyes locked with mine, and for a moment it felt like something was wrong with the way she was looking at me. I wasn't sure if it was the dim light or something deeper, but there was something off about it. I shook the feeling off and focused on the road ahead. The night was stretching on, and the cemetery was getting closer. The air had grown colder, and I could feel the weight of the fog that had started to settle in. So, you're going to visit someone? I asked, trying to break the tension in the air. She didn't respond immediately. Her gaze seemed to drift again, as though she was lost in a memory. I'll never leave, she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I didn't ask what she meant. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I kept driving, trying to ignore the feeling gnawing at my gut. As we neared the cemetery gates, she finally spoke again, her voice calm, almost distant. You can stop here. I'll get out. I pulled over, my headlights illuminating the fog-covered entrance. She didn't wait for me to open the door. Instead, she unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door herself, and stepped out. I sat there for a moment, watching her walk towards the cemetery, her figure swallowed by the mist. Something felt wrong about the whole situation, but I couldn't place it. I was about to drive off when I heard a soft knock on the window. I froze. Slowly, I turned to see her standing next to the door, her face pressed against the glass. She smiled, but it wasn't the same smile. It was different. Her eyes were empty, void of the life they had once held. She didn't speak. She just looked at me, her gaze heavy, and then, as if nothing had happened, she turned and disappeared into the fog. I sat there for a few more seconds, trying to make sense of what just happened. I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing, I couldn't just leave her there. I shifted the car into drive and made my way towards the cemetery gates. But when I reached the spot where she had been standing, there was nothing. Not even her footprints. Shivers ran down my spine as I looked around. The air felt different now, thick with something I couldn't see but could almost feel. I could hear my own breathing, steady but shallow, as I slowly turned the car around and headed back toward the road. The silence in the car was unbearable. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see her sitting in the back seat. But no, the back seat remained empty. That's when I heard it. A soft, faint voice coming from the darkness. Goodbye, and thank you. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed my foot on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. I turned around to look in the back seat, but she wasn't there. I swallowed hard, trying to push the dread from my chest. It was just a figment of my imagination. It was nothing. But when I checked my phone in the morning, it wasn't nothing. The woman I had picked up the night before, she had died the day before the ride. Her obituary had been posted just hours before I had met her. The time of death was listed as just after midnight. I didn't know how to explain it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. All I knew was that she had been the last passenger I would ever pick up. The next morning, I could barely stomach my coffee. My hands were still shaking as I tried to convince myself that it had all been some sort of twisted dream. The fog, the voice, the strange encounter, it didn't make sense. I kept telling myself that there had to be some logical explanation for it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no way to explain away what had happened. The phone call from last night felt like it had happened a lifetime ago, yet the chill in my bones hadn't subsided. I went over every detail, retracing my steps, trying to make sense of everything, but nothing added up. The woman had been real as anyone else I'd driven before. Her voice had been too clear, too calm, and that smile, God, that smile. It was like she knew something I didn't want to know. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept creeping back, like a shadow that clung to the edges of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the obituary I had read this morning. Her name, her picture, it was her. But it didn't make sense. She had been dead before I even picked her up. I glanced at my watch, trying to steady my breathing. It was just after 9 in the morning, and the events of the night were still fresh in my mind. I picked up my phone and checked the timestamps on the obituary. It was clear. Her time of death was listed as yesterday, after midnight. And yet, I had driven her to the cemetery just hours ago. My head was spinning with the possibilities, trying to piece together a theory that didn't involve something supernatural, something beyond reason. But no matter how many times I ran the facts through my mind, it didn't make sense. She had been dead. I had picked her up. And now, she was gone. I had to go back. I knew it was insane, but the pull of that cemetery was like a magnet, a force I couldn't ignore. Something was there, something I had to understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, something I hadn't seen the night before. I grabbed my coat, walked out of my apartment, and headed straight for the taxi. The ride felt almost mechanical as I drove through the streets, my mind reeling with uncertainty. Was I going crazy? Was there some logical explanation I had missed? The cemetery was much the same as it had been last night, foggy, quiet, and still. I parked outside the gates, my headlights cutting through the mist, casting long shadows on the gravestones. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. The place felt different now, colder somehow, like it had become more than just a resting place for the dead. I walked through the gates, my footsteps muffled by the fog and the damp earth. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt like I needed to find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. The graves stood like silent witnesses, their stones withered by time and neglect. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, but there was something more. A low, persistent hum in the distance that I couldn't place. And then I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard in the car last night. Why did you come back? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The fog shifted in front of me, and through the mist, I saw her. The woman. She stood at the edge of the cemetery, her figure bathed in the pale light of the street lamps outside the gates. "You," I managed to choke out, my throat dry. "You're..." She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with those eyes, those empty, knowing eyes. The same eyes that had haunted me all night. "Why did you come back?" she asked again, her voice softer this time, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, but nothing made sense. I had seen her obituary. She was dead. She couldn't be here. "You're not real," I whispered, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. "You're dead. I saw it." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving mine. "Maybe you're the one who's dead," she said, her voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness? Resignation? My chest tightened, the air around me feeling heavier by the second. I felt a coldness creep up my spine, like something was tightening around my chest, suffocating me. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The woman didn't answer at first. She only looked at me, her face unreadable. And then, in the faintest of whispers, she spoke again. "I'm just like you. Stuck in between." I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me. The words made no sense, but the look in her eyes, those eyes, told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't alone here. I turned and bolted, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I ran back to my car. I didn't care if I looked insane. I just needed to get away from this place, away from her, away from whatever had pulled me back here. As I sped away from the cemetery, I could see her figure in my rearview mirror, standing at the gates, watching me leave. I didn't look back again, but I could still hear her voice in my head. "Goodbye, and thank you." The days after that night felt unreal. I tried to return to my normal life, but it was impossible. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman, the voice, the cemetery. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing in the fog, watching me. And every time I drove my taxi through the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, watched by some unseen presence. I couldn't understand it. She had been dead. The obituary had been clear. And yet, I had seen her, had spoken to her. Her words haunted me, lingering in the corners of my mind, stuck in between. I tried to bury the thoughts, to focus on work, to convince myself that it was all just a strange dream. But it wasn't. It couldn't have been. I could still feel the chill of the night, the way the fog had seemed to crawl over everything, suffocating the world around me. I started to avoid driving through the cemetery. I'd take longer routes, anything to steer clear of that place. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the weight of the encounter. It was as if something was pulling me back, forcing me to confront whatever I had experienced. And then, one night, it happened again. I had just finished a long shift and was heading back home. I was tired, exhausted really, my eyes barely able to stay open as I navigated the empty streets. The city was quiet, the roads almost deserted. I reached an intersection when I saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. It was her. The woman. She was standing under the dim street lamp, her figure draped in a long, flowing coat. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel her presence, like a weight on my chest. I pulled over, my hands trembling as I reached for the door handle. part of me wanted to drive away, to keep going, to ignore her like I had tried to before. But something stopped me, something inside me, a need to understand what was happening. I rolled down the window, my voice shaky as I asked, "Do you need a ride?" The woman looked at me, her face still hidden in the shadows. "I need to go to the cemetery," she replied softly. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I didn't know what to say. Was this a joke? Was I losing my mind? Was I somehow stuck in a loop, trapped in some twisted nightmare? I didn't want to take her there, but my hands turned the key in the ignition before I even had a chance to think. I couldn't explain it. I just knew that I had to. The ride was silent. The only sound in the car was the hum of the engine. I kept my eyes on the road, not daring to look at her. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on. Was this real? Was this the same woman from before? When I reached the cemetery, I parked outside the gates. The fog was thick, just like the night before. I could barely see through the windshield, but I could feel her presence beside me. I didn't want to open the door, didn't want to face whatever lay beyond, but I knew I had to. I glanced over at her, and this time I could see her face. It wasn't the same as last night. Her eyes were different. Hollow, empty, as if they had seen too much, as if they were looking through me, not at me. I felt a coldness wash over me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "You," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "You're not real." The woman didn't answer. She only smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said, her voice echoing in the silence. I wanted to run, to leave her behind, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind screaming for me to get away, but my feet wouldn't budge. She opened the door and stepped out, her form swallowed by the fog. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The stillness was unbearable, like the entire world had stopped turning. And then, without warning, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving towards the car. I looked out the window, my heart pounding. There was no one there. The fog had thickened, and I couldn't see past the end of my own headlights. The footsteps grew louder. I turned the key in the ignition, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The engine sputtered, but it wouldn't start. The lights flickered. I punched the steering wheel, desperate, trying to get the car to turn over, but it was no use. The footsteps were so close now, I could hear them just outside the door. I slammed my hands against the dashboard, cursing under my breath. The fog pressed against the windows, suffocating the air, and I felt the pressure building, closing in on me. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was her voice, just outside the car. "Thank you for the ride." And then the world went dark. I woke up in the morning with a start. My hands were gripped tightly around the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I was still parked at the cemetery gates. The fog had lifted, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty road. I rubbed my face, disoriented. Had I fallen asleep? I glanced around, trying to piece together what had happened. The streets were quiet, and everything seemed normal, too normal. But there was one thing that was different. The woman was gone. I got out of the car, my legs shaky, as if I hadn't moved in hours. The air was crisp, and the silence felt unnerving. I looked at the cemetery's entrance, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. But there was no sign of her. The events of the previous night felt like a nightmare, fuzzy and unclear. Had it all been real? Had I really seen her again? I was starting to doubt my own sanity. I wanted to believe it was just exhaustion or stress playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something had happened that couldn't be explained. I checked the time on my phone. It was already past 8 o'clock. I had missed the morning shift. My stomach twisted with unease as I tried to make sense of it all. Then, the phone rang. I jumped, startled by the sudden sound. I answered it quickly, hoping it was someone from the taxi company. "Hello?" I said, my voice still shaky. There was a long pause before a voice on the other end responded. It was familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Are you okay?" the voice asked, soft and concerned. My pulse quickened. "Who is this?" I asked, glancing at the phone screen to check the number. It was an unknown caller. "You've been driving late again," the voice continued. "You need to be careful. Some rides aren't meant for you." A cold chill ran down my spine as the words hit me. I was frozen, unable to speak. The voice continued, this time with a chilling clarity. "You picked her up last night, didn't you? The woman who wanted to go to the cemetery." I felt the blood drain from my face. What do you mean?" I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest. "She died the day before," the voice said, each word slower than the last. "You gave her a ride. You took her where she wanted to go. But you can't escape now." The call ended abruptly. I stood there, motionless, the phone still pressed to my ear. The words of the mysterious caller echoed in my mind. She died the day before. How was that possible? I had spoken to her, driven her, heard her voice. It was as if the line between life and death had been blurred. I felt dizzy, as if the world itself was spinning around me, pulling me deeper into some strange, twisted nightmare. I stumbled back into the car and started the engine. This couldn't be happening. I had to get out of here. I needed to understand. I needed answers. I drove back into the city, my mind racing. What had I done? What had happened to me? I couldn't stop thinking about the voice, about the woman, about the cemetery. I was trapped in something I couldn't escape. When I pulled up to my apartment, I hesitated before stepping out of the car. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if something was waiting for me. My phone buzzed again, and I quickly checked it, praying for something, anything, that would make sense of what had happened. There was a new message. It was from an unknown number. "You didn't listen. It's too late now." I felt a knot form in my stomach. What did that mean? Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the sidewalk. It was her. She stood under the street lamp, looking at me with those cold, hollow eyes. My heart froze in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She was here again. "Thank you for the ride." But this time, it wasn't just a voice. I saw her take a step forward, then another. The fog was returning, rolling in thick and fast, just like the night before. But this time, I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. The world around me seemed to tilt, spinning in a dizzying blur. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, filled the air. And then I understood. I was stuck. Stuck in a loop, trapped in a never-ending ride. Thank you for the ride. The fog swallowed everything, turning the familiar streets into a suffocating blur. I could barely see the figure of the woman now, but I felt her presence. It was as though the very air around me was vibrating with something dark, something unnatural. The silence, once peaceful, now felt like an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. Every breath felt shallow, every second stretched into an eternity. She was closer. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, not by fear alone, but by the understanding that this wasn't a random encounter. There was something more, something far darker at play here. The message, the phone call, the woman, it was all connected, a part of something I couldn't yet comprehend. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if she were savoring each one, knowing that I couldn't escape. The sound of her approach was maddening, each step reverberating in my head, louder and louder, until it felt like the whole world was filled with the echoes of her movement. I tried to force my legs to move, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped in place, unable to break free from whatever this nightmare was. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, she spoke. "Do you remember the ride?" Her voice was soft, but each word felt like it was being carved into my soul. "Do you remember where you took me?" I tried to speak, to deny it, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it. It was impossible to explain. "You didn't save me," she continued, her tone now colder, sharper. "You just drove me. You took me to where I was supposed to be." The weight of her words crushed me. I wasn't sure if I was hearing her words in my head or if she was actually speaking to me, but it didn't matter. The truth was clear now. I had been part of something much bigger than myself, something I couldn't change. I had been a witness to the inescapable, a pawn in a twisted game that I could never understand. Her figure loomed closer, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, in the briefest of moments, the fog seemed to part just enough for me to see it, a graveyard, far in the distance. A single headstone stood out against the mist. I couldn't read the name, but I could feel its pull, like a magnetic force drawing me closer. The woman, now standing right in front of me, smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was a smile of finality, a smile that told me everything I had feared. "You drove me to my end," she whispered, "and now, you're here, too." The air shifted again, the temperature dropping dramatically. The world around me seemed to fade away, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I wasn't standing outside anymore. I wasn't even in my car. I was in the cemetery. I spun around, searching for any sign of escape, but all I saw were the cold, dark graves stretching endlessly in every direction. It was as if I had stepped into a different world, a world where time no longer mattered, and where the dead walked freely. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, not hers this time, but others. Hundreds, thousands, all moving in rhythm, coming from every direction. The ground beneath me trembled as they closed in, their steps synchronized in a haunting dance. I was no longer alone. I turned to face the woman, but she was gone. Instead, I saw a shadow, long and twisted, growing taller with each passing second. The sound of footsteps grew louder, surrounding me. There was no way out, no way to escape. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, pulling me further into this nightmare. The last thing I heard before everything went black was her voice, soft and final. "Thank you for the ride." I had just moved into the building a week ago. It was a new high-rise, modern and sleek, everything one would expect in a place that promised comfort and security. The walls were freshly painted, The elevator smelled of new metal, and the neighbors were friendly enough, though distant. Still, the place was far from perfect. There was something off about the apartment on the 9th floor. I didn't think much of it at first. Every building has its quirks, right? But soon enough, whispers began circulating among the other tenants, stories that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. No one ever went near that apartment. The door was locked, always. Even the landlord avoided it. But at night, something strange would happen. Loud music echoing down the halls. Sometimes it was accompanied by the sound of laughter, as though a party was in full swing behind that door. The odd thing was, no one had ever seen anyone enter or leave that apartment. No one knew who lived there, or if anyone even did. The first night I heard the sounds, I thought it was just my imagination or maybe an old couple in the apartment next door playing their radio too loud. But as the nights went by, the music continued, getting louder, almost as if it was coming from inside my own apartment. It wasn't the kind of music I was used to hearing. It was strange, unsettling. Classical, maybe, or something older, with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. But the laughter, that was what got to me. It wasn't normal laughter. It was too echoing, too hollow, like something pretending to be human. My curiosity got the best of me. I couldn't help but listen. Every night, as the sounds grew louder, I found myself pressed against the door of my own apartment, straining to hear, trying to make sense of it. And every night, the sounds would stop abruptly, as if someone had simply turned off a switch, leaving only the eerie silence. That was until tonight. Tonight, the sounds were different. They were louder, closer, and they came with a distinct chill in the air. I felt at the moment I stepped out of my apartment an unnatural cold that crept down my spine, wrapping around me like an invisible hand. The laughter was louder now, unmistakable. I could hear it clearly, as though it were just around the corner. But no one was in the hall. I stood there for a moment, the darkness of the hallway pressing in on me, making my skin crawl. I could hear the music now, clearer than ever, and there was no denying it. It was coming from the apartment on the 9th floor. I looked up at the door. It was still locked, as it always had been. There was no way in. But something told me that wasn't going to stop me tonight. I didn't know why I felt compelled to investigate. Maybe it was the mystery, the unknown that always seemed to linger in the back of my mind. Or maybe it was the feeling that the sounds were calling to me, pulling me toward that door. Something wasn't right. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I took a deep breath and walked down the hall. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, though I could still hear the music, the laughter, beckoning me forward. When I reached the door, my hand hesitated for a moment. I had to stop myself from knocking, or even just standing there listening. But I couldn't turn back now. I pulled out my phone, checked the time. It was nearly midnight. There was no reason for anyone to be playing music this loud at this hour. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to listen for any sounds of life inside. But all I could hear was the music, and then, strangely, a soft scraping sound, like furniture being moved around. I was about to walk away when I noticed something odd. A small crack in the door frame. It wasn't much, but it was just enough for a sliver of light to peek through. I pressed my eye against the gap, trying to catch a glimpse of the room inside. At first, there was nothing. But then, I saw it. A shadow moving across the floor, pacing back and forth. The figure was tall, thin, and vaguely human. Its movements were erratic, unnatural. I stepped back, my heart racing. The sounds were growing louder now, almost deafening. But I couldn't tear myself away. I reached for the doorknob. The door was slightly ajar. A terrible sense of dread washed over me. I knew I shouldn't go in. I knew I was about to do something I would regret. But curiosity had already gripped me, and I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open. The apartment on the 9th floor was unlike any place I had ever seen. It was dark, save for a single flickering light in the far corner. The furniture was old, covered in dust, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Yet, the music still blared, the laughter still echoed, louder than ever. And then, I saw it. A figure, sitting in the middle of the room, staring at me with cold, unblinking eyes. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The laughter stopped. And in the silence that followed, I heard a voice, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Welcome to my home." The door slammed shut behind me. The door slammed with a force that shook the walls. The loud, jarring sound of it closing echoed in my ears, and my heart skipped a beat. I whirled around, frantic, but there was no handle on the inside. I was trapped. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady as my eyes scanned the room. The figure was still sitting there, perfectly still, its gaze locked onto me. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the dim light of the room. But it wasn't just the way it looked. It was the way it felt, a heavy, suffocating presence that filled the space. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic gripped me, my breath quickening. I slammed my shoulder into the door, pushing against it with all my strength, but it remained locked, as though the apartment itself had swallowed the key. The laughter started again, louder this time. It was almost as if the walls themselves were laughing at me, mocking me for daring to enter. The music, too, was back, a haunting melody that seemed to drift through the air like a slow, creeping fog. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath as I exhaled, a faint mist in the frigid air. I turned back to the figure in the corner. It was still watching me, unmoving. There was something unnerving about its stillness. It was as though it had been waiting for me, expecting me to walk through that door. "What do you want?" I found myself asking, my voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would make it real, make it worse. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly tilted its head, the movement so unnatural it sent a shiver down my spine. Its eyes never left mine, and then, just when I thought it might speak, the music stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my racing heart, the only proof I was still alive in this strange, oppressive place. Then, a soft click echoed in the room. The light flickered and then brightened, casting sharp shadows across the dusty furniture. I turned, my eyes searching for the source of the noise, but before I could make sense of it, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stood up, its long, thin limbs bending in ways they shouldn't have. I took a step back, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, the fear holding me in place like a vice. The figure took another step toward me, and I saw something in its hands, a small, worn-out record player. It seemed so out of place in the gloom of the apartment, as if it didn't belong to this time, this place. The figure didn't speak, but it began to wind the player. The sound of the needle scraping across the record filled the air, and then the music began again, only this time it wasn't the same. It was slower, distorted, like a broken record. The melody twisted, bending in ways that made it sound like something dying, something trying to escape from a place it didn't belong. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was unraveling, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I lunged at the door again, but it was useless. It wouldn't open. "Let me out!" I shouted, the desperation in my voice raw and frantic. "Please, let me out!" The figure stopped, its head tilting in that same eerie motion, and then it spoke. Its voice was like 1,000 whispers, all merging into one. "You can't leave." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I staggered backward, my hands gripping the edge of the dusty table for support. "You can't leave because you're already here," the figure continued, its voice growing darker, more oppressive. "You've always been here." I blinked, trying to make sense of its words. My mind was spinning, my pulse racing, but there was a growing sense of realization creeping in. This apartment, this building, it was wrong. There was something fundamentally wrong with this place. And then it hit me. The laughter, the music, the strange presence, it wasn't just the figure. It was the apartment itself. It had been calling to me, drawing me in with its promises of mystery and answers, only to trap me here. And now, the figure, whatever it was playing its part in this twisted game. "Why?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why me?" The figure didn't answer at first. It just stood there, watching me with its cold, unblinking eyes. And then, as though it had all the time in the world, it moved closer, one step at a time, until it was standing in front of me. "Because you were curious," it said, its voice almost kind now, as if explaining something simple. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing. It brings you places you can never leave." I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder by the second. I could feel the temperature drop even further, until I was shaking uncontrollably. The figure reached out, its fingers long and bony, but I couldn't move, couldn't escape. "Now," it whispered, the last word hanging in the air like a heavy weight, "you belong to this place." The darkness closed in around me, and I felt my consciousness slip away. The last thing I heard was the music, still playing softly in the background, and the distant sound of laughter, like a chorus of voices, rising up to swallow me whole. I woke up to silence. It was strange, unnerving, even. For a moment, I thought I was still trapped in that place, the apartment on the 9th floor, where time didn't exist and shadows whispered secrets that I wasn't meant to know. But as my senses returned, I realized I was lying on the cold floor of my own apartment, not in that terrifying, suffocating place. The air was thick, heavy with the kind of silence that pressed in on you, the kind of silence that fills your head with the sound of your own heartbeat. I sat up slowly, my body stiff, aching as if I had been lying there for hours. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the fog that still clung to my thoughts, but it didn't work. The fear, the raw, unrelenting fear, still lingered, and the memory of that place was too vivid. I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me, and looked around my apartment. Everything was as it should be, nothing was out of place. The cluttered kitchen, the small, dim living room, the hallway that led to the bedroom. But it all felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I walked to the window, pulling aside the curtain and looking out into the city. The skyline was bathed in the soft light of early morning, the streets already starting to wake up. But as I looked out, I noticed something strange. There, across the street, In the distance, I could see the outline of a building. It was the same building from my dream. No, not a dream, I realized with a sudden shock. It had been real. That apartment, that door, that figure, it was all real. My pulse quickened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that I wasn't alone. But when I turned around, my apartment was still empty, still as quiet as ever. There were no figures lurking in the shadows, no voices whispering in the air. Just the sound of my breath. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. I had to know if what I remembered was real. I couldn't just ignore it, couldn't pretend it was some kind of twisted dream. I had to go back. The building stood there, just as it had in my vision, and as I approached the entrance, my stomach twisted into knots. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a warning. But I couldn't stop. Something inside me urged me forward, pushing me into the building, despite every instinct telling me to turn around and run. I took the elevator up to the 9th floor. The elevator creaked, its old metal frame groaning as it ascended. I could hear the whirring of the gears and the clanking of chains, the sound almost deafening in the silence of the building. Each floor passed by, each one slower than the last, until finally, I reached the 9th floor. I stepped out into the hallway. It was exactly as I remembered, the same dim lighting, the same stale air. The walls were cracked, the carpet worn down from years of use. But there was one thing that caught my attention. The door. It was there, in front of me, the door to the apartment that had been locked. The one that nobody dared to open. The door that had called me, that had trapped me in that nightmare. I walked toward it slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I knew I shouldn't do this. I knew it was a mistake. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was inside. I had to understand. The doorknob turned easily beneath my fingers, and the door creaked open with a loud groan. Inside, the apartment was just as I remembered it. Dust hung in the air, the light from the hallway spilling across the worn furniture. The same small record player sat in the corner, its needle frozen in place. But something was different. The air was colder now, and the silence was thicker, more suffocating. I could feel it pressing in on me, pushing me further into the apartment. And then, I heard it. The laughter. It was faint at first, like a distant echo, but then it grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. I could feel it in my chest, the vibrations of the sound, the pulse of it. I stepped further into the room, my body shaking. The figure was gone, but the presence was still there. The room felt alive in a way that was unnatural, like it was waiting for me to do something, to make a decision. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. The figure, standing perfectly still. Its eyes locked onto mine, cold and empty. "You came back," it said, its voice low and hollow, like a distant whisper from the other side. I took a step back, my breath coming in short gasps. I should have left. I should have run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. "You shouldn't have come back," it said again, its voice growing darker, more menacing. "You've crossed the line. There's no turning back now." The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The figure took a slow step toward me, its limbs bending in unnatural angles. The laughter grew louder, the music starting again in the background, distorted and wrong. I turned and ran. The door slammed behind me as I bolted out of the apartment, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the elevator. I pressed the button frantically, my fingers slick with sweat. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, slamming the button for the ground floor. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, but when I looked back, the hallway was empty. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, I didn't hesitate. I rushed out of the building, into the cool night air. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my mind reeling with what had just happened. And yet, as I stood there in the street, trying to catch my breath, I felt it again. That cold presence, that whisper in the back of my mind. The feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned around slowly, and there, standing in the doorway of the building, was the figure. Watching me. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice carrying on the wind. "You'll never leave." And I knew, in that moment, that it was true. I was trapped. I didn't dare take my eyes off the figure standing in the doorway. My feet were frozen to the pavement, and my heart raced in my chest like a wild animal trying to escape. The figure's face remained hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. The wind picked up, howling through the empty street, carrying with it the faint echoes of that haunting laughter. "You can't leave," the figure whispered again, its voice carrying in the wind, each word sending a shiver down my spine. "You will never leave." I turned to run, my legs finally breaking free from the invisible grip that held me in place. But just as I took my first step, I felt something cold brush against my neck, a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, slow and deliberate, like they were following every movement I made. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, my breath ragged, my body screaming for rest. But every time I thought I was making progress, I realized I hadn't moved at all. The buildings around me felt distorted, unfamiliar, like the streets themselves were changing. I ran for what felt like an eternity, the same blocks stretching out endlessly before me, the same streetlights flickering overhead. The world around me was warping, bending, twisting in ways I couldn't comprehend. It was as if I was running in place, caught in some kind of loop, with no way out. And then, I heard it again, the laughter. It was louder now, closer. I could feel it inside my head, reverberating through my skull. It was coming from all directions, echoing from the buildings, from the alleyways, from the very air itself. My breath caught in my throat. I turned, hoping to see the street behind me, but instead, all I saw was the same apartment building. The one I had just escaped from. I was back. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed onto the cold pavement. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was lost in the thick, suffocating silence. The world around me had changed. There was no escape. The figure was there again, standing at the entrance of the building, its face still obscured by shadows. But now, I could hear its footsteps, slow and purposeful, getting closer. "You should never have come here," it said, its voice low and sinister. "This is where you belong now." I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, my hands trembling as I reached out to push myself up. But the figure wasn't alone anymore. There were others. Figures emerging from the darkness, their shapes vague and distorted, like shadows that had taken on life. They moved toward me in unison, their footsteps synchronized, like a choir of whispers and unspoken words. I tried to stand, but the ground beneath me felt slippery, unstable. I reached out to grab something, anything, to steady myself, but all I could find was the cold, rough surface of the pavement. The figures were closing in, and I could hear their whispers now, their voices overlapping in a twisted symphony. I stumbled backward, my eyes wide with fear. I couldn't understand what was happening. These figures, they were real, weren't they? They had to be. This wasn't some nightmare. This was happening to me. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold. Ice cold. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. The figures had disappeared, as if they had never been there at all. I was alone. The street was empty again. The apartment building was gone. In its place was a narrow alleyway leading into the darkness. I didn't want to go down there. I couldn't. But I knew deep down that I had no choice. There was nowhere left to run. I forced myself to move, my feet heavy as I walked toward the alley. The further I went, the darker it became. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls, but there was something else now, a faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone was walking just ahead of me, matching my every step. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was growing louder, closer, until it was all I could hear. My heart raced, my skin prickled with fear. I was being followed. I knew it. And then, at the end of the alley, I saw it. The door. The same door from the apartment. The same door that had been locked, the same door that had called to me. It stood there, half open, just waiting for me to step inside. I hesitated, my mind racing, but I knew what I had to do. I had to face whatever was on the other side. I had to end this. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, everything changed. The air shifted. The temperature dropped. And the world around me seemed to dissolve into shadows. I was no longer in the alley. I was back in the apartment. The room was the same as it had been before, the record player in the corner, the dusty furniture, the dim, flickering light overhead. But there was something else now. The laughter. It was louder, more manic. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner. It was no longer just the sound of voices. It was something else, a deep, hollow, unnatural sound, like the very room itself was alive. I turned to face the figure, the one that had been waiting for me. It was standing in the center of the room, its face still hidden, but now I could feel its presence more than ever. It wasn't just watching me. It was inside my mind, twisting my thoughts, warping my reality. "You're mine now," the figure whispered, its voice like the scrape of metal against stone. And in that moment, I knew it was true. There was no escape. I had crossed the threshold, and now I was trapped here. Trapped in this apartment. Trapped in this nightmare. I had become part of it. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that I was truly trapped in this place, that the figures, the laughter, the suffocating presence, it was all real. But as I stood there, in the dimly lit room, I could feel it deep in my bones. I was no longer in control. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The figure in the center of the room shifted. Its body seemed to elongate, stretching unnaturally, and the shadows around it twisted in response. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the wrong move. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice a low rasp that sent a chill through my spine. "Now, you belong to the apartment." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my legs were frozen, my feet stuck to the ground like cement. Every movement felt impossible. My breath was shallow, my chest tight, as if the very air was being squeezed out of me. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, until it was all I could hear. The room began to spin, the walls closing in around me. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head now, echoing, pulsing, like it was part of me. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. And then, through the chaos of sound and fear, I saw it. A flicker of movement just out of the corner of my eye. The figure wasn't alone. Other figures emerged from the shadows, just like before. They were more defined now, more solid, their features visible, twisted faces contorted in silent screams. They moved toward me in perfect synchronization, their footsteps soft but deliberate, their presence suffocating. My body tensed, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear the creeping, ominous whispers. "You shouldn't have come," the voices murmured in unison, their words like a slow, creeping poison. "Now you're ours." I backed away, my feet stumbling over the cracked floorboards, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. There was nowhere to go. No escape. The walls were pressing in, the room growing smaller, the shadows stretching longer. The figures surrounded me, closing in. I tried to scream, to fight, but it felt like my voice had been stolen from me. I reached out for the door, the only possible escape, but it was no use. It had vanished, just like everything else. I turned to face the figure in the center of the room, the one that had been waiting for me, the one that had lured me here. It stepped forward, its face still obscured by shadow, but now I could feel its gaze on me, colder than anything I had ever known. "You are part of this now," it said, its voice a guttural growl. "You've crossed the threshold. You've chosen." I tried to pull away, but the air felt thick, like I was wading through water. The laughter was deafening now, 1,000 voices, 1,000 souls, all trapped in this place, all echoing through the walls, the floors, the very space around me. I reached out to grasp the nearest figure, desperate for something to hold on to, but as my hand made contact, I felt it, cold, bone-chilling cold that numbed my fingers to the bone. The figure didn't move. It didn't respond. It was just there. Just a presence. The room felt like it was closing in faster now, the walls warping, bending, folding inward like the apartment itself was alive. The space between us and the figures narrowed, and with every step, the air grew colder, thicker, more suffocating. I felt my vision blur. The edges of the room seemed to dissolve, as though the very reality around me was fracturing. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands gripping the floor in an attempt to steady myself, but the ground beneath me was shifting. And then everything stopped. The laughter, the figures, the sounds, the shadows. It was silent. Too silent. I dared to look up, my heart racing in my chest, and for a moment I thought I was free. But then I realized I wasn't alone. The figure was standing right in front of me now. So close I could feel the cold emanating from it, like an icy wind that chilled me to my core. It stared down at me, its face still hidden, but I could feel its eyes boring into mine. "You've joined us," it whispered, its voice thick with something I couldn't understand. "You'll stay with us, forever." The room began to distort once again. The walls twisted and turned, the ceiling bending downward, and the floor seemed to ripple like water. The apartment was alive, shifting, changing, folding into itself like a nightmare that refused to end. I felt my body growing heavier, my limbs weak and unresponsive. I tried to scream, to run, to fight, but there was nothing left to fight against. I was drowning in the air, suffocating in the darkness that surrounded me. The figure leaned in closer, its cold breath brushing my face. "You're ours now." And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. The apartment had claimed me. And now, I was one of them. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.